Hey there, welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of Tommy DeSimone. Maybe you've heard the name, maybe not. But if you've ever seen Goodfellas, you've already met the legend, the real-life inspiration for Joe Pesci's fiery, unhinged character. Some called him fearless, others called him reckless. But in the end, he became something else entirely, the hot-headed gangster who vanished without a trace. A young man who thought he was about to be made, but instead was never seen again. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me, where are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it where you are? It's always wild seeing this little underworld of ours stretch across time zones. Oh, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You don't want to miss what's coming next, trust me. Now take a breath. Let the noise of the day fade away. And follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons. Your Sleepy Dawn. Chapter 1. The Man Who Vanished. January of 1979 was cold in New York. The streets of Queens were coated in a dull, frozen gray, the kind of winter where sound carries differently, sharper, like whispers echoing off the concrete. In that world of ice and steel, a young gangster named Tommy DeSimone thought his life was about to change forever. He was 28 years old, tall and lean, carrying himself with the restless confidence of a man who had lived his entire adulthood with one foot planted firmly in the underworld. That January, he believed he was walking toward the greatest moment of his life, the day he would finally become a made man. What he didn't know was that this walk was not a step toward glory. It was a march into the abyss. Picture the scene. Tommy has been told to be ready, dressed sharp, shoes polished, his usual smirk tempered by a rare flicker of pride. To be made in the Mafia was the ultimate achievement, like a soldier receiving his stripes. It meant respect. It meant protection. It meant the violent, restless kid from Brooklyn had finally been recognized by the highest circle of power. For Tommy, it was everything. And yet, when he walked out the door that day, he might as well have been stepping into a coffin he couldn't see. This wasn't just any routine meeting. In the coded world of organized crime, being invited to a ceremony like this meant you were chosen, embraced, lifted above the rank-and-file street hustlers who never quite made it. It meant a blood oath, loyalty for life. Once inducted, a made man was untouchable, shielded by the iron armor of Mafia law. To touch him without permission was a death sentence. But that protection worked only one way. If you killed a made man without approval, your days were numbered. And Tommy had already broken that law. He believed the call to be made was a long overdue reward for his work, his loyalty, his fearlessness. But in truth, it was something else entirely. Behind closed doors, in smoky rooms where power whispered louder than gunfire, other men had made their decision. To them, Tommy was no longer an asset. He was a liability. Too reckless, too wild, too dangerous. And worse, he had committed the unforgivable sin. He had murdered a Gambino family-made man named Billy Batts. That act alone sealed his fate. But on that cold January day, Tommy didn't see any of that. He saw only the finish line. Imagine the nervous rush of a man convinced he's about to step into history. His wife at home. His crew believing the same story he did. A future where he'd stand equal to the very men he'd idolized. That anticipation must have felt electric, like the hum in the air before a storm. He probably rehearsed it in his mind, how he'd shake hands, how he'd hear the words that would change his life forever. Instead, he vanished. No ceremony, no elevation, no glory, just silence. One day he was there, and the next he was gone. His wife, never to see him again. His friends, left with rumors and half-truths. His enemies, satisfied that justice, Mafia justice, had been served. The man who thought he was walking toward immortality was instead walking toward erasure. In the world of organized crime, disappearing wasn't uncommon. But the way Tommy disappeared carried a weight that would echo for decades. Think about that. One moment, he's part of the most feared crew in New York, his name tied to hijackings, robberies, and murders. The next, he's reduced to nothing but a ghost story whispered in bars and back rooms. No funeral, no grave, Just a question mark hanging in the cold winter air. How does a man simply vanish in a city that never sleeps? In the Mafia, the answer was simple. If they wanted you gone, you didn't exist anymore. But Tommy wasn't just any gangster. He was young, volatile, unpredictable. He was the kind of man who could charm you with a joke and then kill you for looking at him the wrong way. His volatility made him useful at times, but it also made him dangerous to the very men he served. By 1979, too many bodies had piled up around him. Too many rules had been broken. Too many grudges had been ignited. The Gambinos hadn't forgotten Billy Bats. And the Lucchese's, the very family Tommy worked for, couldn't protect him forever. So that day, when Tommy believed he was about to rise into the inner circle, he was instead walking into a trap. It was a cruel irony, the Mafia's version of poetic justice. He would die chasing the very dream that every associate lived for. To be made. To belong. To matter. That dream turned out to be the bait on the hook. Think of the psychology of it. To the Mafia, loyalty was everything. But loyalty wasn't love. It was control. Associates like Tommy were disposable, pawns in a game where kings and bosses decided the rules. And the moment Tommy became a liability, he was written off like a bad debt. They dangled his ambition in front of him like a carrot, and when he reached for it, they pulled the ground out from beneath him. The details of what happened next are murky. Accounts differ. Some say he was lured to a basement, told to sit down, told this was his big moment. Some say John Gotti himself oversaw the execution, exacting vengeance for Billy Bats. Others believe he was killed quietly, almost clinically, erased in the shadows with no spectacle at all. In Mafia terms, it doesn't matter. What mattered was that he was gone. The how, the who, the where, those details dissolved into rumor. The only certainty was his absence. And that absence burned. His crew felt it immediately. Jimmy Burke, the cold strategist. Henry Hill, the hustler with a knack for survival. Both of them understood instantly what had happened. They didn't need a body to know. They knew Tommy had crossed the line, and the line had swallowed him whole. But even knowing, there must have been a chill that crept through them. If Tommy could vanish, so could anyone. In the Mafia, your security was always conditional, always one mistake away from collapse. For Tommy's wife, it was something else entirely. One day, a husband. The next, silence. No answers. No closure. Just a void where a life used to be. In that world, questions were dangerous, and grief had to be swallowed quietly. To ask too much was to invite the same fate. So she lived in the shadow of his disappearance, carrying the weight of a man who had vanished not just from her life, but from the face of the earth. And yet, Tommy's story didn't end with his disappearance. In some ways, it only began. His violent streak, his recklessness, his unpredictability, all of it would live on in stories told by Henry Hill, in books like Wise Guy, in films like Goodfellas. Joe Pesci's Oscar-winning performance immortalized him as the fiery, psychotic character audiences couldn't forget. But behind the Hollywood version was a real man, one who walked into a room one winter day and never walked out again. That's the paradox of Tommy DeSimone. In life, he was feared and hated in equal measure, a man whose temper made him both useful and doomed. In death, or rather, in disappearance, he became legend. The gangster who vanished. The man whose story ended in silence, but whose shadow still lingers in pop culture decades later. As we begin to peel back the layers of Tommy's life, it's important to remember that behind every nickname, behind every story, there was a human being. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband. And yet, he was also a killer, a man who chose violence time and time again. That contradiction, human and monster, family man and psycho killer, is what makes his story so haunting. January 1979 was just the ending. To understand why Tommy vanished, we have to understand everything that came before. The streets he grew up on. The family ties that pulled him into the underworld. The choices that hardened him into the kind of man who thought respect was worth more than life itself. The night he disappeared, the snow kept falling in New York. Cars hummed past. People walked their dogs. Life carried on like nothing had happened. Somewhere, in some backroom or basement, Tommy DeSimone's story was being cut short. No one in the city could hear it. No one knew. It was like a candle being snuffed out in a storm, sudden, final, unnoticed. But in the Mafia, nothing is ever really hidden. Whispers always find their way out. Rumors slip through cracks. And soon enough, everyone in that world knew Tommy was gone. And he wasn't coming back. The question that remains, the question that still haunts, is how exactly it all went down. Did he see it coming in that last moment? Did he realize the truth too late? Did he feel betrayal more than fear? These are the questions we'll never have answers to. They are locked away in the silence of men who took those secrets to their graves. What we do know is this. In January of 1979, Tommy DeSimone believed he was about to be reborn. Instead, he was erased. The man who thought he was about to rise into power instead became the man who vanished. And that vanishing is the thread that pulls us back into the shadows of Brooklyn, into the story of how a boy became a killer and how a killer became a ghost. Because to understand how Tommy ended, we have to start at the beginning. Chapter 2, Brooklyn Bloodlines. The sound of the city in the 1950s was different than it is now. Brooklyn streets carried a rhythm, a pulse that could make even a quiet block feel alive. The clatter of elevated trains, the hiss of steam rising from grates, kids shouting over stickball in the middle of the street. But behind the ordinary noise, there was another beat, one that most families pretended not to hear. It was the whisper of the mob. Deals whispered over kitchen tables. Envelopes passed in the back of bars. Hands shaken with a look that meant more than words. For some families, that beat was distant background noise. For others, it was the soundtrack of their lives. And for the DeSimone family, it was destiny. Tommy DeSimone was born into that world in May of 1950. He didn't choose it, not at first. But the streets around him, the people at the dinner table, the quiet respect given to certain men who walked into the room. Those were lessons that shaped him before he even understood them. Imagine being a child and noticing that some men made your father lower his voice, that their presence filled the room like smoke. Even without knowing the word mafia, Tommy knew power when he saw it. The DeSimones were not strangers to the underworld. Bloodlines ran deep, and Tommy's extended family had long been tied to organized crime. His brothers and cousins were all caught up in it to some degree, and the network of names and connections stretched far beyond one block or one borough. His sister would eventually marry Peter Vario, the son of Paul Vario, a capo in the Lucchese family. That marriage, that link, was more than family. It was a direct artery into one of the most powerful crime crews in New York. Tommy might as well have been born with one foot already planted in that life. But childhood isn't just connections and names. It's the details that stay with you. The cramped Brooklyn apartment with its smells of garlic, cigarette smoke, and coffee strong enough to peel the paint off the walls. The arguments about money. The longshoremen who came home broken by labor. The women who stretched every dollar until it squeaked. That environment carved people into survivors. And when survival mixed with crime, the lines blurred fast. Tommy was a restless kid, never the type to sit still. Teachers saw a boy who couldn't focus, quick to anger, quicker to lash out. Neighbors saw a boy always hanging around the older kids, copying their swagger, imitating the way they carried themselves. Even then, his temper was legend. One insult could set him off, and the explosion was never small. Some kids would stomp their feet and sulk. Tommy, he'd throw fists, smash bottles, whatever it took to prove he wouldn't be disrespected. In neighborhoods where reputation was currency, that reputation grew fast. He was dangerous before he was even a teenager. But the streets of Brooklyn weren't just about danger, they were about loyalty. Friendships mattered. Who you stood with mattered even more. In that world, you weren't just Tommy, the kid from the block. You were Tommy, the DeSimone kid, part of a family name that meant something. And with his sister's marriage into the Vario family, that meaning multiplied. The Varios were the real deal. Paul Vario wasn't just a neighborhood tough guy. He was a capo in the Lucchese crime family, one of the ruling men in a criminal empire that stretched from city rackets to airport cargo holds. In a world where money moved in shadows and respect was enforced with bullets, Paul was a heavyweight. And through his sister's marriage, Tommy was suddenly tied to that heavyweight like a blood knot. It didn't make him untouchable, not yet, but it gave him something every ambitious kid in Brooklyn wanted: proximity to power. For a boy like Tommy, power was magnetic. He saw how Paul Vario carried himself, how men leaned in when he spoke, how businesses opened their doors wider when he walked in. Respect was visible. Fear was invisible, but just as real. And Tommy absorbed it like oxygen. This wasn't just admiration. It was aspiration. He wanted that life, even if he didn't yet understand the cost. But power came with lessons, lessons that shaped Tommy's worldview. The Mafia wasn't just crime, it was order. It was structure. It was like the Catholic Church of the streets: rules, rituals, hierarchy. You didn't just grab what you wanted. You earned it, or you took it with permission. And for kids like Tommy, that permission often came in the form of errands, small jobs, little tests. A stolen car here, a hijacked truck there, run a message, deliver an envelope. Every test was a doorway, and passing meant you were one step closer to the inner circle. Tommy passed those tests, but not quietly. His temper, the same one that made him feared as a kid, never went away. If anything, it sharpened with age. He wasn't just known as a young man willing to do jobs. He was known as someone who could explode at the drop of a hat. That volatility made him useful. If a debt needed collecting or someone needed to be taught a lesson, Tommy could do it without hesitation. But volatility also made him dangerous, even to those who trusted him. The streets remember things. Neighbors remembered the kid who lashed out. Crews remembered the young man who never backed down. And the Mafia? The Mafia remembered bloodlines. To them, Tommy wasn't just some kid with a short fuse. He was a DeSimone, tied by marriage to the Varios. That gave him credibility. It also gave him expectations. The kind of expectations that could push a man into roles he wasn't ready for. Imagine being in your late teens and already standing in the orbit of men who ran entire criminal economies. Most kids that age are worrying about school, jobs, maybe the draft. Tommy was worrying about making the right impression on men who could make or break him with a single decision. The weight of that expectation is hard to imagine. It was like standing on a stage where every gesture, every word, every silence could be judged. Fail, and you were nothing. Succeed, and you were on the path to becoming something greater. Tommy's family roots gave him opportunity. His personality gave him notoriety. But together, they created something combustible. A man who felt destined for the top, but carried all the flaws that could destroy him. He didn't yet know it, but those flaws were already shaping his future. Brooklyn in those years was a breeding ground for men like Tommy. The city was alive with corruption, opportunities at every corner. Truck hijackings, loan sharking, gambling. If there was money moving, the mob had their hands on it. And kids from the right families were groomed to step into those rackets. For Tommy, the grooming wasn't gentle. It was trial by fire. His temper was both his weapon and his weakness, and the older mobsters watched carefully, measuring whether it made him valuable or made him a liability. By the time he was 20, the verdict was clear. Tommy had what it took to be feared. And in the Mafia, fear was often more valuable than love. But fear had a cost. It alienated as much as it protected. And already, whispers followed him. That he was too unpredictable. That he was dangerous not just to enemies, but to his own friends. Still, the bloodlines held him close. With the Vario name tied to his, Tommy wasn't just another hot-headed kid. He was a potential player in the Lucchese machine. And Paul Vario, ever calculating, knew that potential was worth nurturing, even if it came wrapped in volatility. The connection meant doors opened for Tommy that others could only dream of. He wasn't an outsider clawing his way in. He was family. And in the Mafia, family was the skeleton key. But a skeleton key opens doors in both directions. It lets you in, yes, but it also locks you into the system, chains you to its rules. Tommy, young and restless, didn't yet see those chains. All he saw was opportunity. All he felt was hunger. And all the men around him saw was a boy with bloodlines that tied him to power, and a temper that could be used like a blade. In the years to come, that blade would cut deep into friends, into enemies, into the very fabric of the Mafia itself. The seeds of his rise and his downfall were already planted in those Brooklyn bloodlines. And as Tommy grew, so did the shadow of what he would become. The story of Tommy DeSimone doesn't begin with violence on a winter night in 1979. It begins here, in Brooklyn, with a boy shaped by family, tempered by the streets, and bound by blood to the Vario crew. A boy whose destiny was written in whispers long before he ever knew how it would end. But destiny is a dangerous word in the mafia, because for every door that opens, another closes. And Tommy's door was about to open wider than ever before, pulling him into a world where respect was measured in fear, and survival was a coin tossed in the air. And as that door opened, Tommy would step through, never realizing how close the shadows were waiting behind it. Chapter 3: Growing Up in the Shadows. The first time Tommy DeSimone drew real blood as a teenager, it wasn't planned. It wasn't part of some carefully orchestrated mob job. It was raw impulse, the kind of violent eruption that told the men around him this wasn't just another neighborhood kid. It was a scuffle that went too far, fists turning to rage, rage turning to something sharper. When it was over, Tommy stood there breathing heavy, chest rising and falling, his knuckles wet and red. He was barely in his teens, but in that moment, everyone watching understood what kind of man he was becoming. Some kids carved their names into desks at school. Tommy carved his into people's memories. By the time most boys were worrying about homework and girlfriends, Tommy was already standing with one foot in the criminal world. He ran errands for older mobsters, carried envelopes, delivered small packages. Every trip was a lesson. He was learning how the mafia's invisible rules worked, when to speak, when to shut up, when to show strength, and when to show fear. For a teenager, it was intoxicating. Imagine being 15 years old and realizing that grown men with reputations, men twice your age, actually respected you, or at least feared what you might do. For Tommy, that was fuel. The streets of Brooklyn in the 1960s were unforgiving. They rewarded those who acted without hesitation and chewed up those who hesitated. Tommy didn't hesitate. His temper was a switch that flipped fast, and once it flipped, it was hard to turn back off. He became the kind of teenager people avoided provoking, not because he was the biggest or the strongest, but because he was the least predictable. In a world where reputation was as valuable as cash, that unpredictability was his calling card. Violence for Tommy wasn't just an outlet. It was a language. Some people negotiated with words, with charm, with persuasion. Tommy negotiated with his fists, his kicks, the occasional flash of steel. And in the world of organized crime, that language carried weight. Older mobsters noticed. They saw in him someone who could be useful, someone who could be pointed at a problem and trusted to make it disappear. The question was whether he could ever learn restraint, or if his fire would burn out of control. At home, the shadow of crime hung over the dinner table like a ceiling fan spinning endlessly overhead. His family knew what paths were available. Honest labor meant breaking your back on the docks, scraping by with calloused hands and empty pockets. The other path, the one whispered about but rarely admitted, meant money, respect, power. Tommy saw both and made his choice early. Why scrape by when the men with suits and Cadillacs were offering you a seat at their table? His teenage years were marked by small crimes, petty thefts, hijackings that seemed minor at the time, but carried lessons that would shape his future. Hijacking a truck wasn't just about stealing. It was about timing, intimidation, knowing when to apply pressure and when to vanish into the night. It was a game of chess played on asphalt. For Tommy, it became second nature. The rush of adrenaline, the feel of power, the way fear in another man's eyes felt like currency. That was addictive. But there was another side to him. In moments of calm, people who knew Tommy remembered a boy who could laugh, who could charm, who could sit at a table with family and seem almost ordinary. That was part of what made him so frightening. He could shift from warmth to violence in an instant, like a light bulb shattering without warning. That duality, human and monster, boy and killer, was what defined his teenage years. As he grew older, his connection to the Vario crew through his sister's marriage became more important. Those ties gave him legitimacy, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just a hot-headed kid running wild in the streets. He was tied by blood to men with real power. And that connection put him on a track few others his age could dream of. For Tommy, It was intoxicating. He wasn't just running with neighborhood punks. He was brushing shoulders with the machinery of the mafia itself. But teenage ambition often runs faster than teenage wisdom. Tommy wanted everything: respect, fear, money, and he wanted it now. That impatience drove him deeper into violence. He didn't wait for opportunities. He created them, often with his fists, sometimes with a weapon. Older men in the mob world began to notice him more, but not always in a good way. Some admired his fearlessness. Others worried about his volatility. It was like watching a fire burn. You admire the heat, but you also wonder when it will spread and burn everything down. In those teenage years, Tommy's temper became his defining feature. Stories began to circulate, stories of how he would erupt at the smallest slight, how he would take things further than anyone else dared. Reputation in the mafia was like armor, and by his late teens, Tommy's armor was already thick. He was feared, he was respected, but he was also whispered about. That whisper carried both promise and danger. Picture him at 17, striding through Brooklyn streets with the swagger of someone much older, shoulders squared, eyes scanning every corner. He wasn't invisible like other kids his age. He stood out because everyone knew he was capable of going too far. That kind of notoriety is like gravity. It pulls you deeper into the world that feeds it. And for Tommy, there was no pulling back. Even in his teenage years, there was a sense of inevitability around him. Friends could see it. Family could feel it. This wasn't a boy who was going to grow up, get a steady job, raise kids, and fade into obscurity. This was a boy marked by shadows, marked by bloodlines, marked by a hunger that would either carry him to power or bury him early. That inevitability was a heavy cloak, one he wore proudly, even if he didn't understand what it truly meant. The men he looked up to, Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, others in the Lucchese orbit, watched him with cautious eyes. They saw a weapon being sharpened. The question was whether it would be sharpened into a tool or left to cut wildly in all directions. Tommy's teenage years were the proving ground. Every fight, every job, every eruption was part of his audition for a life in organized crime. And he passed that audition not with charm or cunning, but with violence. Yet, even as he built his reputation, there was something tragic about it. Underneath the swagger, underneath the explosions of rage, was still a kid trying to prove himself. A kid desperate for respect, desperate to matter, desperate to be seen as more than just another Brooklyn punk. In a world that respected only strength, he used violence as his language, as his currency. But deep down, the hunger wasn't just for fear, it was for recognition, for belonging, for a seat at the table where decisions were made. By the end of his teenage years, Tommy DeSimone had already become a name whispered in backrooms. He wasn't just another errand boy anymore. He was on the radar, a rising figure whose volatility made him both valuable and dangerous. The shadows he grew up in weren't just around him anymore. They were inside him, shaping every decision, every outburst, every ambition. And as he stepped into adulthood, one truth became clearer with every passing day. Tommy DeSimone was never going to live an ordinary life. He was destined for something darker, something bloodier. The boy who grew up in the shadows was already becoming the man who would vanish into them. The question was no longer whether he would rise in the mafia. The question was how far his rage would carry him before it consumed him completely. And that question, hanging heavy over every street corner, every whispered story, every stolen glance, was about to be answered in ways no one could predict. Chapter 4. Ties That Bind. Family in the mafia world was never just about blood. It was a web, an invisible net that pulled you in and held you tight, whether you wanted it to or not. For Tommy DeSimone, that net was spun around him from the moment he was born. His family name carried whispers. His relatives carried reputations. And by the time he was old enough to understand, the path in front of him was already marked. In the mob, family was both shield and shackle, blessing and curse. And for Tommy, it was both the foundation of his rise and the chain that dragged him toward his fall. The open loop in his story begins with this truth. Without the Vario family, Tommy might have been just another Brooklyn tough, another name that burned fast and then vanished into the smoke of the streets. But through his sister's marriage, he was tied directly to Paul Vario, a Lucchese capo whose influence stretched across Queens, Brooklyn, and beyond. Paul wasn't just a neighborhood figure. He was a boss, a man who sat near the top of a pyramid built on rackets, hijackings, and loyalty enforced at gunpoint. To have your sister married into that bloodline was like being handed a key to a kingdom, one where the doors were lined with velvet, but every lock clicked shut behind you. Tommy's family, the DeSimones, already had mob ties of their own. His brothers were involved. His cousins had reputations. It was a name that carried weight, but not enough to guarantee protection. In the Mafia, names could open doors, but they couldn't always keep you safe. Respect had to be earned, usually with money or violence, often both. Still, the DeSimone name meant that Tommy wasn't just some street punk drifting into trouble. He had a pedigree, a lineage that meant he was taken more seriously than most boys his age. Family mattered in ways outsiders rarely understood. In everyday life, family was where you shared meals, celebrated weddings, mourned deaths. But in the mob, family was also the first line of defense. If a man owed money, his family's reputation was weighed before a decision was made on how to handle it. If someone was suspected of betrayal, the question wasn't just what he had done, but who he was connected to. Bloodlines were like insurance policies, a way of reminding everyone that violence carried consequences beyond a single life. For Tommy, this meant that his anger, his volatility, was often given more room to breathe. People thought twice before crossing him, because to cross Tommy was to risk offending the larger families tied to him. But loyalty in this world wasn't love. It was duty. It was a contract written in silence and enforced with fear. The Varios weren't protecting Tommy out of affection. They were protecting him because family connections demanded it. To abandon a blood tie was to admit weakness, and weakness in the Mafia was fatal. Tommy benefited from that protection, but he also carried the weight of it. Every outburst, every crime, every whisper about him reflected back on the families tied to his name. This is where the paradox begins. Family gave Tommy his path upward, but it also magnified every flaw. His hot temper wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It became a liability for the Varios, a stain on the Lucchese name. And yet, for years, that same volatility was tolerated, even used, because it served a purpose. He was a blade in their hands, dangerous, sharp, unpredictable, but effective when pointed in the right direction. Think about loyalty in terms anyone can understand. Imagine playing on a team where losing wasn't an option, where stepping out of line didn't just get you benched, it got you killed. In that kind of game, loyalty wasn't a choice. It was survival. And the deeper you were tied by blood, the less choice you had. Tommy didn't need to sign contracts or pledge vows. His bloodline had already done that for him. At family gatherings, the code was reinforced in subtle ways. A look across the table, a hushed story told in the corner of the room, the way older men carried themselves, demanding respect without ever raising their voices. These weren't just dinners. They were silent seminars in power. Tommy was the kind of kid who watched, absorbed, and internalized. He saw how respect flowed towards certain names, how fear followed certain reputations. He wanted both, and he learned that family was the quickest bridge to get there. But bridges can collapse. And in Tommy's world, family ties could tighten around your throat just as easily as they lifted you up. Every mobster knew this. There were endless stories of men betrayed by their own blood, of brothers testifying against brothers, of cousins gunning each other down. In the Mafia, family was both sacred and expendable. It was the most powerful bond and the most fragile. For Tommy, the importance of family was drilled into him as both shield and weapon. When he lashed out at rivals, he knew the Vario name stood behind him, giving weight to his actions. When he strutted through the streets, he carried not just his own reputation, but the accumulated reputation of everyone tied to him. That was intoxicating. It made him fearless, but it also made him careless. Because when you believe your name makes you untouchable, you stop realizing just how quickly that protection can evaporate. The Mafia's code of loyalty was often described as honor among thieves, but it was more like a fragile glass. beautiful when intact, deadly when shattered. To outsiders, it looked unbreakable. To insiders, it was constantly at risk. Tommy was a teenager stepping into that code, treating it like armor. But armor cracks when struck hard enough, and Tommy's reckless violence was already testing those cracks. Imagine a boy barely into manhood, already feeling like he belonged to something larger than life. For Tommy, that belonging was everything. He wasn't an outsider scraping at the door. He was inside, or at least he thought he was. That illusion gave him confidence, swagger, fearlessness. But it also blinded him to the reality that family ties didn't grant immunity. They only delayed consequences. And Tommy's consequences were waiting for him, patient, inevitable, as if history itself was keeping score. The Varios used Tommy when they needed muscle, when a point had to be made. His family gave him cover when his temper flared too bright. But every use, every cover, was a note written in a ledger. A debt building. And debts in the Mafia are always collected, one way or another. Family was supposed to protect. But family also judged. Paul Vario and the men around him saw in Tommy both promise and danger. They saw a weapon sharpened too fine, a knife that could cut the hand of the one holding it. For now, the bloodlines held him safe. But whispers were already forming. That maybe Tommy's volatility wasn't just youthful fire. That maybe it was a flaw that couldn't be controlled. This is the irony of Tommy's story. The very ties that elevated him were the same ties that would eventually tighten into a noose. His family gave him opportunity, yes, but it also put him under a spotlight he could never step out of. Every move was magnified, every failure echoed louder. Family gave him a path, but family also gave him expectations. And when he failed those expectations, the fall would be harder because the ties that once bound him would also betray him. Picture Tommy at a family wedding, the music loud, the tables filled with food and laughter. He's drinking, smiling, looking like any young man caught up in the joy of the moment. But in the corners of that same room, quiet conversations are happening. Older men watching him closely, measuring him. Family gatherings were never just about celebration. They were about observation. In the Mafia, every occasion doubled as a reminder, you were never off stage. By his late teens and early 20s, Tommy believed in the power of family ties with all his heart. He thought they made him untouchable, but untouchable was a myth. In reality, those ties bound him more tightly to the code than ever before. If he broke it, his family name wouldn't save him. It would condemn him. Because when a family member broke the rules, it wasn't just about the individual. It was about the stain it left on everyone connected. Punishment, in that sense, became not just necessary, but inevitable. And so Tommy lived with the double-edged sword of family. Every fight he picked, every man he beat, every insult he refused to let slide, it all fed into the legend of his fearlessness. But behind the legend, the quiet truth was forming. Family loyalty gave him power, but it would also write the script for his downfall. The ties that bound him to the Varios, to the Lucchese's, to the Mafia's unwritten code, were growing tighter with every passing year. And Tommy, hungry, reckless, ambitious, was pulling on those ties harder than anyone else. Soon, those ties would pull back. And when they did, the boy who believed family made him invincible would discover that in the Mafia, bloodlines don't always protect you. Sometimes, they're the reason you disappear. Chapter 5, Paul Vario's Crew. It begins in the back of a smoky bar in Queens. The jukebox hums low, glasses clink, and every conversation seems to drop when certain men walk through the door. In that room, the atmosphere shifts like gravity itself bending. You can feel it without anyone saying a word. This wasn't just a place to drink. It was the beating heart of Paul Vario's crew. And into that world, still young and brash, walked Tommy DeSimone. He wasn't yet the feared figure he would become. He was just another hungry kid on the edge of something bigger. But the moment he stepped into Vario's orbit, his life was sealed. Paul Vario wasn't just a mobster. He was a force, heavy-set, with a quiet authority that carried more weight than any shouted order. Paul controlled his part of Queens like a chessboard, moving pieces with precision. Every racket, every hustle, every hijacking that passed through his territory funneled back to him. He was a capo in the Lucchese family, a captain who sat between the bosses at the top and the soldiers who carried out the dirty work. And to be pulled into his crew was like being recruited into an army where loyalty was sworn not to a flag, but to a man. Tommy's entry wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden lightning bolt of recognition. It was a slow pull, like a tide dragging him in deeper and deeper. His connection through family, his sister's marriage to Paul's son, opened the door. But bloodlines only got you in the room. To stay there, to be trusted, you had to prove yourself. And in Paul's crew, proving yourself usually meant money in the envelope or blood on the floor. Paul's crew operated out of Robert's Lounge, a dingy neighborhood bar that doubled as headquarters. To outsiders, it was nothing special. To insiders, it was the center of gravity, the place where plans were whispered and lives were decided. Tommy started showing up, hanging close, listening more than talking. In a world where silence could be golden, he learned quickly that ears mattered more than mouths. He fetched drinks, ran errands, did whatever was asked. Each small job was a test, and Tommy passed those tests with eagerness. But eagerness wasn't enough. The men around him were veterans, guys who had been running scams and hijacking since before Tommy was born. They didn't need a kid with wide eyes. They needed muscle. They needed someone who could collect debts, intimidate rivals, keep order when things went sideways. That's where Tommy's volatility, the very thing that worried his family, became an asset. He was young, yes, but he was fearless. Fearless in a way that was almost reckless. And in the world of Paul Vario's crew, reckless could be useful. Think of Paul's crew like a machine. Every part had a role. There were the planners, the earners, the fixers, and then there were the enforcers, the gears that kept the machine moving through intimidation and violence. Tommy was slotted into that role almost immediately. He had the size, the willingness, and most importantly, the temper. Where others hesitated, Tommy lunged. Where others considered consequences, Tommy acted. That kind of fire made him dangerous, but it also made him valuable. The first real job that tied him to the crew was a hijacking. It wasn't glamorous. It never was. Truck hijackings were the bread and butter of crews like Vario's, stealing goods straight off the highway before they could reach their destination. Clothes, liquor, electronics, it didn't matter. If it could be sold, it could be hijacked. Tommy wasn't in charge, but he was there, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had been doing it for decades. When the truck was pulled over, when the driver's eyes went wide with fear, Tommy didn't flinch. He stared the man down, radiating the kind of threat that made compliance immediate. Older men noticed. This kid wasn't just tagging along. He was part of it. From then on, Tommy was no longer just a hanger-on. He was in. And once you were in, there was no out. That's the unspoken rule in the Mafia. The family you're born with matters, but the crew you serve becomes your real family. And Paul Vario's crew was now Tommy's blood. Paul himself kept a distance. He wasn't the kind of man who held your hand or praised your work. His approval was silent, measured in whether you were invited back, whether you were trusted with bigger jobs. Tommy earned that trust quickly, and soon he was rubbing shoulders not just with other young associates, but with men like Jimmy Burke, a man whose mind for money and crime made him a legend, and Henry Hill, the hustler who always had one foot in the game and another in survival. These men would become the axis around which Tommy's life revolved. But trust in Paul's crew came with responsibility, and responsibility came with pressure. Tommy wasn't just expected to show up. He was expected to produce. Money had to flow upward. If you hijacked a truck, the cut went to Paul. If you ran a scam, Paul got his share. That was the tax of belonging. And while Tommy enjoyed the perks, respect, fear, access, he also felt the weight of expectation. The Mafia wasn't a charity. It was a business, and every man had to pull his weight. The deeper Tommy sank into the crew, the more his temper became both weapon and warning sign. There were stories, even then, of jobs that should have ended clean but spiraled out of control because Tommy pushed too far. A driver beaten more than necessary. An insult answered with fists instead of words. Violence was currency, but too much of it could draw heat. Law enforcement was always circling, and the last thing Paul wanted was unnecessary attention. But as long as Tommy produced, as long as money kept flowing, his fire was tolerated. There was something magnetic about the way Tommy carried himself in those years. Tall, lean, with a mix of charm and menace. He embodied the contradiction of the mafia associate. At times, he could be funny, even disarming, quick with a joke that made everyone at the table laugh. Other times, he could snap into cold fury so fast that even hardened mobsters hesitated. That duality, boyish laughter and ruthless violence, made him unpredictable. And in a crew built on fear and respect, unpredictability could be its own form of power. Paul Vario's crew gave Tommy something he had always craved: belonging. For a kid who grew up watching men with power move through rooms like kings, being part of the crew was validation. He wasn't just Tommy anymore. He was Tommy, part of Paul Vario's operation, standing in the shadows of men who shaped the underworld. That belonging gave him confidence, swagger, a sense of immortality. But it also gave him illusions. Illusions that his bloodlines, his connections, his crew would protect him from the consequences of his recklessness. In reality, every move he made was being watched. Every outburst was noted. In the mafia, nothing went unnoticed. The same men who praised his fearlessness whispered about his volatility. The same crew that embraced him as one of their own also measured how long he could last before his fire consumed him. It was a paradox. He was both protected and endangered by the very crew he served. The irony was sharp. The family that brought him in was the same family that would one day sign off on his disappearance. But in the beginning, all Tommy could see was the glory. The cars, the cash, the respect. He didn't yet see the ledger being kept, the silent accounting of his every act. That ledger would decide his fate long before he ever realized it existed. By the time Tommy was firmly entrenched in Paul Vario's crew, the path was set. There was no going back to ordinary life. No straight job. No quiet future. He was a soldier now, even if not officially. His hands were already stained, his reputation already inked in fear. And while he believed family ties made him untouchable, the truth was darker. The crew didn't bind you with affection. It bound you with debt. And debts in the mafia are always collected. The boy from Brooklyn, restless and hot-headed, had found his place in the underworld. But the place he thought was home was also a trap. Because in the mafia, loyalty was demanded, not given. And for Tommy DeSimone, loyalty would prove to be the rope that pulled him deeper into darkness. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every laugh at Robert's lounge, every job on the streets, every moment he thought he was climbing higher, was really one more step toward the shadows that would one day swallow him whole. Chapter 6. The Roberts Lounge Crew. It always starts with a door. In this case, a heavy door on Lefferts Boulevard in Queens, one that creaked when it opened and closed with a dull thud that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. Step through it, and you weren't just entering a bar. You were entering a world where loyalty was tested, lives were decided, and money flowed in stacks of unmarked bills. Robert's lounge was dimly lit, the walls stained from years of cigarette smoke, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and fried food. To most passers-by, it looked like just another neighborhood joint. But to those who knew, it was something else entirely. It was the headquarters of Jimmy Burke's crew, a place where plans for million-dollar heists were whispered over drinks, where debts were settled with threats, and where the young hothead named Tommy DeSimone found his true home. Picture Tommy the first time he really stepped inside, still young, but already carrying himself like he belonged. His tall frame filled the doorway, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the scene. At one table, Henry Hill leaned back in his chair, smiling, his sharp eyes scanning every face, always calculating. At another, Jimmy Burke sat quietly, a drink in front of him, his reputation filling the room more than his words ever could. Around them were soldiers, earners, hangers-on, all orbiting the gravity of this crew. For Tommy, it must have felt like stepping onto a stage where every role was already cast. And yet, he knew he was about to write himself into the script. Jimmy Burke, known as Jimmy the Gent, was a paradox. Charming, generous with his friends, ruthless with his enemies. He had a knack for planning jobs that made real money, not just the nickel-and-dime hustles of street kids. He understood the system, how to grease the right palms, how to move stolen goods like a legitimate businessman. And he had Robert's Lounge as his fortress, his boardroom, his sanctuary. Men came to him for work, for guidance, for protection. Jimmy didn't just run jobs. He ran people, and he ran them well. Henry Hill was different. Half Irish, half Sicilian, never able to be a made man because of his bloodline, but invaluable because of his hustle. He had a way of making connections, smoothing over rough edges, finding angles where others saw none. He was a natural survivor, always keeping one step ahead, always knowing when to talk and when to stay silent. Together, Jimmy and Henry were the brains and the charm of the operation. And when Tommy entered the picture, they found their fire. The dynamic between them was electric. Jimmy was the strategist, Henry the middleman, Tommy the enforcer. They were like parts of a machine, each one filling a role the others couldn't. Jimmy needed muscle he could trust, someone who wouldn't hesitate when hesitation could mean failure. Henry needed someone to intimidate when words weren't enough. Tommy needed direction, a channel for his rage, a place where his violence wasn't just tolerated but valued. The three of them clicked, and soon they were inseparable. Robert's Lounge wasn't just their hangout. It was their headquarters. Deals were brokered there, envelopes stuffed with cash passed across sticky tabletops. In the back rooms, stolen merchandise was counted and divided. Trucks were hijacked on the highways and their loads fenced through contacts Jimmy had cultivated. Clothes, cigarettes, liquor, electronics. Anything that could be moved quickly and sold for a profit found its way through Robert's Lounge. And every job fed into the pockets of Paul Vario, who sat at the top of this pyramid, pulling strings through Jimmy. But Robert's Lounge was more than money. It was theater. It was where reputations were built, where stories of violence and daring were retold until they became legend. Tommy thrived in that environment. Every story about his temper, every whisper about his unpredictability only made him more feared. And fear, in that world, was respect. Men who might have laughed at him outside those walls thought twice before doing it inside, because they knew Tommy's eruptions weren't just stories. They were warnings. Yet, for all the camaraderie, there was tension. The crew lived in a constant state of paranoia, always watching for cops, for rivals, for betrayal. Every joke carried an edge. Every smile masked suspicion. Even in moments of laughter, there was an undercurrent of danger, like a loaded gun left on the table. Tommy, with his short fuse, only heightened that tension. There were times when his temper nearly derailed jobs, when his need to assert dominance risked bringing heat down on everyone. But Jimmy, for a while, kept him close, believing his loyalty and fearlessness outweighed the risks. Think of Robert's Lounge as a pressure cooker. Every man inside it wanted more money, more respect, more power. The walls absorbed their ambitions, their fears, their betrayals. Tommy sat in that mix, a young man convinced he was destined for greatness, yet blind to the fact that every explosion of violence etched his name deeper into a ledger that would one day seal his fate. What made the crew dangerous wasn't just their willingness to commit crimes. It was their ability to do it with precision. Hijacking trucks wasn't just about brute force. It required timing, planning, knowing which drivers could be scared into silence and which ones needed a harder push. Loan sharking wasn't just about lending money. It was about making sure repayment was inevitable, whether through fear or broken bones. Gambling operations weren't just about taking bets. They were about keeping the cops at bay while making sure the odds always favored the house. These were businesses, dirty ones, but businesses all the same. And Robert's Lounge was the office where they operated. For Tommy, this was heaven. He didn't just have a seat at the table, he had a role. Every time he collected a debt, every time he enforced the crew's will, he proved himself. He wasn't just living in the shadows anymore. He was becoming one of the shadows. His friendship with Henry grew fast, a bond forged in the fires of shared risk. His loyalty to Jimmy grew deeper, built on respect for a man who treated him like more than just muscle. Together, they became a trio that would define some of the most notorious moments in New York's criminal history. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Tommy's violence wasn't always controllable. The same temper that made him feared also made him reckless. Stories began to spread of beatings that went too far, of murders carried out not for business but for pride. In a world where every move was supposed to serve the family's interests, Tommy sometimes acted only for himself. And while Jimmy and Henry laughed it off, or smoothed it over, those cracks were noted by others. In the Mafia, nothing went unrecorded. Every flaw was filed away for later. Still, for a time, the trio thrived. The money rolled in. The respect grew. And Robert's Lounge pulsed with life, its walls holding secrets that could topple empires if they ever got out. For Tommy, it felt like destiny unfolding. He had the crew, the power, the protection. He believed nothing could touch him. But destiny has a cruel way of twisting. Every laugh at the bar, every whispered plan, every truck hijacked was another turn of the wheel. And that wheel was spinning faster than any of them realized. Robert's Lounge was a sanctuary, but it was also a trap. The same walls that held their secrets also held their sins. And in time, those sins would demand payment. For now, Tommy basked in the glow of belonging. He was no longer the restless boy from Brooklyn. He was part of something larger, something dangerous, something legendary. But the legend was already writing itself in blood. And the men laughing with him at Robert's Lounge would one day be the same men whispering about his disappearance. Chapter 7. Hijackings and Hustles. The headlights cut through the darkness on the Van Wyck Expressway. A tractor-trailer humming steadily down the road, its driver unaware that within minutes his entire night was about to change. The first car pulled in front of him, slowing just enough to force him down. Another car appeared in the side mirror, boxing him in. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. The doors flew open, men spilled out, and one of them was Tommy DeSimone. Tall, sharp, his eyes blazing with that dangerous mix of adrenaline and impatience. He yanked the door open and pressed steel against the driver's ribs. The message was simple, unspoken. The truck wasn't his anymore. That night, like so many others, belonged to Robert's Lounge. This was how money moved in the underworld. It wasn't about corporate boardrooms or signed contracts. It was about fear, leverage, and speed. Truck hijackings became the bread and butter of Paul Vario's crew, orchestrated by Jimmy Burke with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony. Every truck was a moving bank vault, filled with clothes, cigarettes, liquor, or electronics. Anything that could be sold fast, before the ink was even dry on the driver's police report. And Tommy thrived in this world. Where others hesitated, he lunged. Where others calculated, he exploded. In those early years, he wasn't just part of the hijackings. He became their embodiment, the raw edge that made the crew so feared. But hijackings were only the beginning. Once the goods were stolen, they needed to be moved, sold, fenced. And that's where the wider web of hustles came in. Robert's Lounge was more than just a hangout. It was a marketplace. Inside, cartons of stolen cigarettes might be stacked in the back room, waiting to be unloaded at a discount to neighborhood stores. A truck full of liquor could be sold off within days, bottles moving from one set of hands to another until every trace of its legitimate origin was buried. Money poured in, not in clean bills but in stacks wrapped with rubber bands, slipped across tables in dim light. Loan sharking was another artery of cash flow. To the average man on the street, it looked like easy money. Borrow a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, no questions asked. But the trap was hidden in the details. Interest piled on like bricks. Miss a payment, and the smiles turned to threats. Keep missing, and men like Tommy showed up at your door. The Mafia didn't need contracts. They had fists, bats, and the unshakable knowledge that no police report could protect you from the consequences. To explain it simply, loan sharking was like quicksand, easy to step into, almost impossible to climb out of. And Tommy was the enforcer who made sure no one ever tried. Gambling was everywhere, another steady vein feeding the machine. Bets on sports, card games in basements, dice rolling on backroom tables. It all flowed upward to the crew. Gambling wasn't just recreation in those neighborhoods. It was escape, obsession, sometimes addiction. And addiction meant leverage. The house always won, not because of luck, but because the crew made sure of it. Tommy, along with Henry and Jimmy, made regular rounds, collecting winnings, leaning on losers, reminding everyone that debts in their world weren't just about money. They were about survival. And then there were the shakedowns, the simplest hustle of all. Walk into a business, smile, remind the owner that accidents happen, that trucks crash, that fires start. For a weekly envelope of cash, those accidents would never touch them. For a bigger envelope, maybe business would get even better, maybe rival trouble would disappear. It was extortion dressed as protection, a wolf disguised in sheep's clothing. Business owners often paid with gritted teeth, knowing they hated the men but fearing them more. And if anyone ever hesitated, Tommy was there, his presence alone enough to break resistance. Every hustle carried its own rhythm, its own set of rules, but the heart beating behind them was always the same: fear. Fear was the invisible ink that wrote every contract in that world. It was cheaper than lawyers, more reliable than courts. Fear was the glue that held the entire operation together. And Tommy understood fear better than most. He didn't just use it. He lived in it, fed off it, exhaled it like smoke from a cigarette. His temper was legend, his willingness to escalate unmatched. For debtors, for gamblers, for business owners, seeing Tommy at the door was enough to make knees shake. He was the nightmare that kept their payments coming on time. Yet beneath the steady flow of money, there was always danger. Hijackings drew police attention. Loan sharking created enemies who might talk. Gambling dens were vulnerable to raids. Shakedowns bred resentment that could fester. Every dollar made came with risk attached, and the crew lived in a constant state of balancing profit against exposure. Jimmy's careful planning often kept the balance steady, but Tommy's volatility tipped it often enough to make people uneasy. He didn't always see the bigger picture. To him, a slight was a slight, and respect was worth more than strategy. That mindset made him effective in the moment, but in the long run, it stacked enemies like sandbags waiting to break. Still, the money kept flowing. Truck after truck disappeared. Loan books thickened. Gambling profits soared. Shakedown envelopes piled up. Robert's Lounge pulsed with the rhythm of crime, its walls absorbing the laughter of men drunk on cash and power. And Tommy, still in his 20s, felt like he had found the secret to life. He wasn't punching a clock. He wasn't standing on the docks breaking his back. He was part of something bigger, something that commanded respect, something that made him feel immortal. But immortality in the Mafia was an illusion. Every hustle carried the seeds of betrayal. Every job created the possibility of an informant. Every debt collected risks sparking revenge. And in Tommy's case, every eruption of violence carved his name deeper into the ledger of men marked for retribution. His willingness to cross lines, to turn business into blood, made him valuable to Jimmy in the short term. But to the Mafia as a whole, it was dangerous. Business was supposed to be business. Tommy made it personal. And personal, in that world, was lethal. The hijackings and hustles defined Tommy's rise, but they also defined the cracks that would widen beneath his feet. He was a perfect enforcer in a world that demanded brutality. But brutality without restraint is like gasoline near a fire. It doesn't just fuel the flame. Eventually, it consumes everything around it. As the money stacked higher, as the crew's reputation grew sharper, Tommy walked taller, laughed louder, burned hotter. But the same temper that made him feared was already writing the ending of his story. The men around him knew it, even if he didn't. Every hijacking, every loan collected, every shakedown, it all pushed him further into the life he thought he wanted, but closer to the fate he couldn't avoid. The trucks kept coming. The money kept flowing. The power kept growing. And Tommy kept pushing, faster and harder, convinced that nothing could touch him. But in the Mafia, nothing lasts forever. The hustles that built empires could also destroy them. And for Tommy DeSimone, the line between fortune and fatality was already beginning to blur. Chapter 8. The Enforcer Emerges. It happened in the back room of Robert's Lounge, the kind of place where the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and the tension could snap like a wire pulled too tight. A gambler had fallen behind on his payments, again. He had excuses, promises, stories about bad luck and near wins. Most men in the crew would have rolled their eyes, leaned in with a quiet threat, maybe given him a few more days to make it right. But Tommy DeSimone wasn't most men. He didn't like stories. He didn't like excuses. And that night, the gambler's words were barely out of his mouth before Tommy's fist came down, splitting his lip wide open. In seconds, the room shifted from casual conversation to chaos. Chairs scraped back, voices rose, and Tommy kept swinging. The man's pleas drowned under the sound of knuckles cracking against bone. By the time Jimmy Burke pulled him off, the gambler was a mess of blood and fear, trembling as though death itself had brushed past him. The money would come, of course it would. Not because the gambler suddenly had it, but because fear could make a man find resources he never knew existed. That was Tommy's gift, if you could call it that. He didn't just enforce rules. He made examples. And as word spread, his reputation began to harden like cement. Tommy was young, but he carried himself like a man who had nothing left to prove. Tall, lean, sharp-featured, he wasn't the stocky brawler people might expect. But what he lacked in bulk, he made up for in volatility. He could be laughing with you one moment, his face alive with charm, and then turn cold the next, his eyes narrowing with a look that made your stomach drop. That unpredictability was terrifying, because you never knew which Tommy you were going to get. The fun one who told jokes and bought drinks, or the enforcer who could put a bullet in you for stepping out of line. In the mafia world, reputation was everything. It was your currency, your insurance, your shield. And Tommy's reputation for violence grew fast. People whispered that he was a psycho, but they said it with respect, with fear, because being called a psycho in that world didn't mean you were crazy. It meant you were dangerous. It meant people hesitated before crossing you. And in the game of survival, hesitation was often the difference between life and death. Tommy's temper became the stuff of legend. He couldn't stand disrespect, not even a hint of it. An offhand comment, a smirk, a sideways glance. Those were enough to light the fuse. There was no slow burn with Tommy. The explosion came instantly, leaving people scrambling to pick up the pieces. Even his closest friends, Jimmy and Henry, admitted they were nervous around him. They loved him, trusted him, but they also feared him. Because once that switch flipped, there was no reasoning with him. No negotiation, just violence. It was that violence that made him invaluable to the crew. When someone needed to be taught a lesson, Tommy was the man they called. He wasn't subtle, but he was effective. Loan payments suddenly appeared. Debtors who thought they could play games stopped playing. Rival crews thought twice before stepping into Vario territory. Fear rippled outward, and at the center of it was Tommy. He had become the enforcer, the sharp edge of the blade. But violence is a double-edged sword. The same qualities that made him feared also made him dangerous to his own side. There were times when jobs went wrong not because of police or rivals, but because Tommy pushed too far. A beating that should have ended with a warning ended instead with a body. A confrontation that could have been resolved with words escalated into gunfire. In the mafia, violence was a tool, not a toy. It was supposed to be controlled, used with precision, like a scalpel. Tommy wielded it like a sledgehammer, smashing everything in sight, sometimes breaking more than he fixed. Still, for a time, his fire was tolerated, even celebrated. Men admired his fearlessness. They told stories of his outbursts in tones that mixed horror with awe. He had become larger than life, a figure who seemed untouchable, immune to consequences. And Tommy believed it too. He wore his reputation like armor, convinced that his family ties, his connection to Paul Vario, his bond with Jimmy Burke would protect him. He thought he was too valuable to be discarded, too feared to be eliminated. But in the mafia, no one was untouchable. The irony was that Tommy's unpredictability, the very thing that defined him, also kept him isolated. People respected him, but they didn't get too close. They laughed at his jokes, but they never forgot what he was capable of. Behind every smile was caution. Behind every handshake was calculation. They knew that one wrong word could turn them from friend to target. That isolation was invisible but real. Tommy thought he was surrounded by loyalty, but in truth, he was surrounded by fear. And fear has a way of evaporating when it's most needed. One of the most telling signs of Tommy's growing reputation came not from his enemies, but from his own friends. Henry Hill later described how even simple moments carried danger. A card game could turn into chaos if Tommy lost his temper. A barroom conversation could end in violence if someone said the wrong thing. His friends lived with a kind of constant tension, waiting for the next eruption. They loved him, yes, but they also braced themselves around him, like standing too close to a live wire. In the underworld, men like Tommy served a purpose. They kept the machine running smoothly, ensuring that debts were paid, rules were followed, and respect was maintained. But they also carried an expiration date. The Mafia valued loyalty and discipline above all else. Violence was expected, but only when ordered, only when it served the family's interest. Unchecked violence drew attention, brought heat, risked everything. And Tommy's violence was rarely checked. He was a storm that couldn't be contained, a fire that burned wherever it wanted. As his reputation spread, so did the whispers. He was effective, yes, but could he be controlled? He was loyal, but only to a point. He obeyed orders, but his temper made him unpredictable. In a world where stability was prized, instability was dangerous. And Tommy's instability was growing. Still, he reveled in the role. He liked being the enforcer. He liked the fear in men's eyes, the silence that followed his footsteps, the way people backed down at the sound of his name. For a kid from Brooklyn, for someone who had grown up watching men with power and wanting it for himself, this was validation. He had arrived. He mattered. He was somebody. But being somebody in the Mafia always came with a cost. And Tommy, blinded by his own reputation, couldn't see how high that cost would be. Every beating, every eruption, every moment of violence was being recorded in the invisible ledger that governed the underworld. That ledger had no erasers, no forgiveness. It only had balance sheets. And when the time came, the balance would be paid in full. For now, though, Tommy was the enforcer. The man who made others fall silent. The man who could make debts appear out of thin air. The man whose temper kept entire neighborhoods in line. But the same temper that gave him power was the one thing that would one day strip it away. And as the stories of his violence grew louder, as the fear around him deepened, the shadows waiting for him grew darker. Because in the Mafia, storms are useful until they become uncontrollable. And once they do, the men who once called you brother start sharpening the knives. Chapter 9. The Murder of Billy Batts. The jukebox played loud inside the dim glow of the bar, but the music couldn't drown out the tension that was building. It was June of 1970, and in that Queen's barroom, two men from the same world, two men who understood the Mafia's code better than most, stood on the edge of an explosion. One of them was William "Billy" Batts Bentvina, a made man in the Gambino family, just out of prison and eager to celebrate. The other was Tommy DeSimone, young, volatile, and burning with resentment. That night would become one of the most infamous in mob history. Because by the time the music stopped, Tommy's rage would cross a line that no one in the Mafia could ever uncross. It started with words. It almost always did. Batts, older and respected, had known Tommy when he was just a teenager shining shoes to make a little money. Now, years later, in a crowded barroom with drinks flowing, Batts grinned and told him to go get his shine box. To outsiders, it might have sounded like a joke, an offhand ribbing between old acquaintances. But in the Mafia, words carried weight. Respect was everything, and disrespect, even in jest, was like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. Tommy's face tightened. Those who knew him could see it, the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes narrowed. A storm was building. Jimmy Burke, sitting nearby, tried to ease the tension, raising his glass, offering a smile, as if to wave the words away. Henry Hill, watching, later recalled how the air seemed to thicken, how everyone knew what might come. But there was no stopping it. Batts had lit the fuse, and Tommy wasn't the kind of man to let it burn out quietly. Still, Tommy didn't strike immediately. That was part of what made the moment so chilling. He held it in, let the insult sit like a knife turning in his gut. Hours passed. Drinks flowed. The bar buzzed with laughter and conversation. But in Tommy's mind, the words kept echoing. Get your shine box. To him, it wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder of his past, a dismissal of everything he had clawed for, a way of putting him back in his place. And Tommy didn't tolerate being put in place by anyone, least of all a made man. When Bats was comfortable, when the room had thinned, Tommy made his move. He returned to the bar with a fury that had been simmering all night, and suddenly, the simmer boiled over. He lunged at Bats, fists flying, the violence raw and unrelenting. Chairs crashed, glasses shattered, and Bats, older but still proud, tried to fight back. But Tommy's rage was unstoppable. Jimmy and Henry joined in, the crew swarming over Bats, dragging him to the floor. What followed wasn't a fight. It was an execution disguised as a beating. The brutality shocked even hardened men. Tommy stomped and kicked, every blow fueled by years of pent-up fury. Blood pooled, teeth scattered across the floor, the jukebox still humming in the background like a soundtrack to madness. Bats groaned, struggled, but each time he moved, another kick came down, another punch landed. When it was done, he wasn't dead yet, but he was close. They dragged him out, thrown like a sack into the trunk of a car, the night air heavy with the stench of blood and gasoline. Driving through the dark, the men were silent, each of them processing what had just happened. In the back of their minds, they all knew the truth. Tommy had crossed a line no one was supposed to cross. Killing a made man without permission was the ultimate violation of mafia law. It was a rule written in blood, enforced with death. To kill a made man was to spit in the face of the entire organization. And yet, in that moment, Tommy didn't care. He had been disrespected, and in his world, disrespect was answered only with violence. But the mafia wasn't the streets. It wasn't a place where you could settle scores without consequences. It was an organization built on rules, structure, hierarchy. The bosses allowed violence, but only when it served a purpose, only when it was sanctioned. Tommy's killing of Billy Bats wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't business. It was personal, and personal killings were poison. The crew buried Bats temporarily, thinking they could cover their tracks. But paranoia set in. They worried about the body being discovered, about questions being asked. Weeks later, they returned to move him, digging in the dirt, the smell unbearable, the body decomposed and grotesque. It was a grim reminder that no matter how hard you tried, blood had a way of resurfacing. The mafia's code might allow for murder, but it didn't allow for mistakes. And killing Bats was more than a mistake. It was a death sentence hanging over Tommy's head. For Jimmy Burke, the murder was a problem. Jimmy cared about money, about keeping the crew productive, about staying out of the spotlight. This killing brought nothing but risk. For Henry Hill, it was terrifying. He had always lived with one foot in and one foot out, but now he was tied to a killing that could bring the wrath of an entire family down on their heads. Both men knew what Tommy didn't seem to understand, or maybe what he refused to accept. The Gambinos would not forget this. And they didn't. Word spread quietly, as it always did. Whispers in back rooms, murmurs in smoky lounges. Everyone knew Bats had been killed, and everyone knew who had done it. The only question was when the bill would come due. The mafia had patience. They didn't need to rush. They could wait years, letting the illusion of safety lull Tommy into believing he had gotten away with it. But the code was clear. The killing of a made man demanded retribution. It wasn't optional. It wasn't negotiable. It was inevitable. Tommy, in his arrogance, thought his connections would shield him. He thought Paul Vario's name, Jimmy Burke's protection, his own reputation for fearlessness would be enough. But no protection could cover this. Not forever. The rules were bigger than any one man, bigger than any one crew. The rules were what held the mafia together. And when the rules were broken, blood had to flow. In the weeks after Bat's murder, Tommy walked taller, as though the killing had elevated him. He boasted, laughed, carried on as if nothing had happened. But behind closed doors, even his friends were uneasy. They had seen the violence, had felt the danger, had heard the whispers. They knew the storm was coming. They just didn't know when it would break. Killing Billy Bats was the beginning of the end for Tommy DeSimone. The moment his fists came down that night in June, his fate was sealed. He might not have realized it, blinded by his pride, deafened by his rage. But everyone else could see it. He had written his death warrant with every kick, every stomp, every drop of blood spilled on that barroom floor. The irony was brutal. The very act that cemented his reputation as a feared enforcer was the act that doomed him. In the Mafia, fear was power, but rules were stronger. And Tommy, for all his fire, for all his violence, for all his ambition, had broken the one rule no man could ever break. Years later, when he vanished, when he walked into what he thought was his initiation ceremony only to disappear forever, the men who had once called him brother knew exactly why. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the shadow of Billy Batts, stretching from that barroom in 1970 all the way to Tommy's final day. The murder of Billy Batts was more than just a killing. It was a turning point. A moment when one man's temper collided with the unbreakable laws of the Mafia. And from that moment on, no matter what Tommy did, no matter how much money he made, no matter how feared he became, he was already a dead man walking. The night Billy Batts died, the clock started ticking. And for Tommy DeSimone, that clock would never stop. Chapter 10, Friends Aren't Safe Either. The card game was noisy, full of laughter, cigarette smoke curling into the air, the clatter of chips against wood. It should have been an ordinary night inside Robert's lounge. Men played cards, told stories, threw insults across the table like darts. But in the corner stood Michael Gianco. Everyone called him Spider. A skinny kid barely out of his teens, pouring drinks, fetching bottles, trying to make himself useful. He wasn't a gangster, not really. Just a kid working in a mob hangout, earning a few dollars, catching scraps of the life these men lived. And yet, in that world, even a kid like Spider wasn't safe. The trouble started small. Someone called for a drink. Spider hesitated, maybe misunderstood. Tommy DeSimone didn't like the delay. He didn't like being ignored. And when Tommy didn't like something, the room knew it. The tension rose like smoke, visible but intangible, thickening the air until it was hard to breathe. Tommy barked at him, sharp words cutting through the chatter, and Spider, nervous but not stupid, shot back a comment of his own. It wasn't much, barely a sentence, but it was enough. Enough to cross the invisible line of respect. Enough to make Tommy's blood boil. The first shot came fast. Tommy pulled a gun and fired, the crack of the bullet echoing through the room. Spider stumbled, a scream catching in his throat as pain tore through his leg. The room went silent. Men stared, stunned. It was supposed to be a joke, a warning, a way of putting the kid back in his place. Even Jimmy Burke laughed nervously, brushing it off, telling Spider to dance. The young kid limped, blood dripping onto the floor, trying to play along, because what else could he do? In the Mafia world, humor and horror often lived side by side. And that night, they were tangled together in a way no one could untangle. But Spider came back, bandaged, limping, still pouring drinks days later. Maybe he wanted to prove he wasn't afraid. Maybe he had no choice. And that night, during another card game, another round of insults flew across the table. Someone joked about the leg, about the limp. Spider, perhaps emboldened by survival, muttered something back, low but clear. It was the kind of comment you'd expect from a kid sick of being pushed around, sick of being treated like dirt. But it was also a death sentence. The gun came out again. Tommy didn't hesitate this time. He pulled the trigger, bullets ripping through the air, slamming into Spider's chest. The kid collapsed instantly, blood spreading across his shirt, eyes wide in disbelief, as if he hadn't fully registered that his life had just been stolen. The room erupted in chaos. Some men shouted. Others cursed. Even Jimmy, hardened as he was furious. Killing a made man without permission was one thing. But killing an associate, a kid, over a smart remark? That wasn't just reckless. It was insane. And yet, this was who Tommy was becoming. The enforcer wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. He was enforcing his own pride. Disrespect, no matter how small, was met with violence. A joke, an insult, even a hint of mockery could bring down his wrath. Spider's murder wasn't about money. It wasn't about business. It wasn't even about survival. It was about Tommy's inability to let anything slide. His temper was the judge, jury, and executioner, and in that world, no one was safe. Not even friends, not even kids on the sidelines. The killing sent ripples through the crew. Some were horrified, Some shrugged it off, but all of them remembered. They remembered the look on Spider's face, the casual way Tommy pulled the trigger, the complete absence of hesitation. That absence became his trademark. Where other men might pause, weigh options, consider consequences, Tommy acted. And his actions were final. Fear spread quietly. Men who once joked freely around him grew cautious. Conversations stiffened. Smiles were forced. They never knew when a laugh could turn into a trigger pull. Tommy's friends loved him, but they feared him too. That fear was useful in keeping order, but it also isolated him. It carved a distance between him and everyone else. The more violent he became, the fewer true friends he had. Everyone was a potential target. Everyone walked on eggshells. The Mafia thrived on respect, but respect was a delicate balance. It was supposed to be earned, maintained, measured. Tommy didn't measure it. He demanded it, and he demanded it instantly. That demand made him powerful in the short term, but dangerous in the long run. Because in a life built on codes and rules, even killers had to show restraint. Tommy showed none. The murder of Spider was whispered about in the crew for years. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others shook their heads at the waste. But all of them understood what it meant. It meant Tommy's violence wasn't just for enemies. It wasn't just for outsiders. It could strike anyone, at any time. And that made him unpredictable in a way that unsettled even seasoned mobsters. Spider's body disappeared, as bodies always did. No funeral, no grave, no closure for whatever family he had. Just silence, a void where a life had been. In the Mafia, that silence was normal. But the silence around Spider's murder was heavier, sharper. It was the silence of men wondering what kind of storm they had welcomed into their crew. Tommy didn't regret it. At least, not outwardly. He laughed, boasted, shrugged it off like it was nothing. Maybe that was his armor, his way of justifying an act so brutal it even unsettled his own crew. Or maybe he truly didn't care. Maybe the rush of power, the thrill of dominance, was worth more to him than the life he had taken. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. His reputation grew darker, his name sharper. He was no longer just an enforcer. He was becoming something else entirely, a man whose violence knew no boundaries. That transformation didn't go unnoticed. The bosses, the higher-ups, the men who valued discipline and control, began to see Tommy as a liability. He could kill without hesitation, yes, but he could also kill without purpose. And in their world, purposeless killing wasn't strength. It was weakness. It brought attention, risk, heat. And heat was deadly for everyone. The murder of Billy Batts had already marked Tommy for death. But Spider's murder marked him as something else, a loose cannon, a man whose violence couldn't be contained, whose loyalty was overshadowed by his rage. And in the Mafia, men like that didn't last. They couldn't, because one day, the same violence that kept everyone in line would be the reason the crew turned on him. For now, though, Tommy walked taller. He had silenced another voice, erased another insult, proved again that no one could cross him. But each step forward was another step toward the inevitable. The ledger was filling, the debts piling up. And every bullet he fired was another line in the story of how he would eventually vanish. The card games continued. The drinks flowed. Robert's lounge hummed with life. But for those who were there, those who saw Spider fall, the memory lingered. The crack of the gun, the look on his face, the sudden silence after the chaos. It was all burned into their minds. They knew then what Tommy himself couldn't see. Friends weren't safe. No one was. And in a world built on loyalty, what happens when loyalty is no longer enough to keep you alive? Chapter 11. A Reputation of Fear. The laughter stopped suddenly, like a record needle scratching across vinyl. One moment the crew was telling stories, glasses clinking. The next they were frozen, holding their breath. Tommy had gone quiet. That was always the warning sign. His voice dropped, his grin vanished, and his eyes locked onto some unlucky soul. In that silence, you could feel the temperature shift. Men who had faced cops, prison, even rival gangs stiffened, knowing the explosion was coming. Because when Tommy DeSimone turned, there was no predicting what he'd do next. Henry Hill would later describe those moments with a mix of awe and unease. He admired Tommy. He loved him like a brother. But he was afraid of him too. Everyone was. They never said it out loud, not when Tommy was around. But the truth was unspoken, stitched into every nervous glance, every careful pause before they spoke. Tommy had earned a reputation, not just as an enforcer, not just as a killer, but as something more unpredictable, something closer to a storm that could tear through anything without warning. Fear was currency in the mafia. It was the invisible paycheck every gangster collected before money ever hit the table. And Tommy was rich in it. His name carried weight, not because of years in the life or high rank in the family, but because of what people had seen him do. Stories spread fast in that world. Stories of beatings, of killings, of explosions of rage so sudden they left men stunned. And each story added another layer to his reputation, until Tommy was no longer just a man. He was a warning. One story Henry loved to tell captured the essence of Tommy's terror. A small-time hustler, drunk and careless, made the mistake of brushing against Tommy at a bar. It wasn't much, just a shoulder bump, the kind of thing most men would laugh off. But Tommy didn't laugh. He turned, eyes blazing, and within seconds the man was on the floor, choking on blood, begging for mercy. No one in that room moved. No one dared to step in. They watched in silence, because they knew intervening might make them the next target. That's who Tommy was, capable of turning a minor slight into a near-death sentence. Another story painted him in darker colors. At a poker game, a man cracked a joke at his expense. Nothing serious, just the kind of ribbing that usually ended with laughter and a drink. But Tommy didn't laugh. He reached for his gun, pulled it out, and pointed it across the table. The room froze. The man's smile evaporated, replaced by the realization that he might not leave alive. For a long, unbearable moment, Tommy held him there, the weight of life and death resting on his finger. And then, just as suddenly, he laughed, holstered the gun, and let the game continue. Everyone laughed nervously, but the message was clear. With Tommy, you were never safe. It wasn't just outsiders who felt it. Even his friends, even the men closest to him, carried that fear. Jimmy Burke relied on him. Henry trusted him, but they also walked on eggshells around him. They knew one wrong word could spark a fire. They loved him, yes, but it was the kind of love you gave to a wolf. Admiration mixed with caution, affection wrapped in fear. They couldn't predict him, and unpredictability in the mafia was more dangerous than a gun. What made Tommy terrifying wasn't just his violence. It was his unpredictability. Violence in the mafia was business. It had rules, reasons, calculations. But Tommy's violence was personal. It wasn't measured. It wasn't ordered. It wasn't weighed against profit or risk. It erupted from pride, from anger, from the smallest sense of disrespect. And that made him dangerous in a way the bosses couldn't control. To understand how fear worked around Tommy, you have to think of it like electricity. Most men in the crew carried a low hum, a steady current of danger you could sense. But Tommy was lightning. Sudden, blinding, destructive. You never knew when or where it would strike, but when it did, it lit up everything around it and left wreckage in its wake. That kind of reputation spread fast, through whispers in bars, through nods in smoky back rooms. Everyone in the life knew the name. Everyone knew what it meant. Henry often said that being around Tommy was like living with a time bomb. He could be the funniest man in the room, cracking jokes, telling stories, making everyone laugh until their sides hurt. But the laughter always came with an edge, with the knowledge that in a blink, it could turn into something else. That duality was exhausting, exhilarating, and terrifying. And it made Tommy unforgettable. The spider incident cemented that reputation in ways words never could. Killing a kid over an insult wasn't just shocking, it was a declaration. It said no one was exempt, no one was safe, not even friends. That story traveled, twisted, retold, each version adding to the myth of Tommy the Psycho. Men told it with nervous chuckles, shaking their heads, but the fear behind their eyes betrayed them. They weren't laughing at the story. They were laughing to mask the terror of what it meant. Fear worked for Tommy. It gave him power. It made men pay debts on time, kept rivals away, silenced potential snitches. but it also worked against him. Fear isolates. Fear makes allies keep their distance, makes bosses question your stability. The same men who used him as muscle also whispered about his volatility. And in the Mafia, whispers could kill. Tommy didn't see it that way. To him, fear was respect. He believed men feared him because they respected him, because they saw his strength, his loyalty, his willingness to do whatever it took. But respect and fear aren't the same. Respect lasts. Fear fades. Respect builds loyalty. Fear builds silence. And silence, in the Mafia, often means betrayal. By the early 1970s, Tommy's reputation was set in stone. He was the enforcer, the psycho, the man you didn't cross. But that reputation was a double-edged blade, cutting as much inward as outward. The crew loved him, but they feared him. The bosses used him, but they distrusted him. And the Gambinos, well, they were waiting. Waiting for the right moment to remind him that no amount of fear could outweigh the rules of Cosa Nostra. Henry would later say that everyone knew Tommy's story couldn't end well. They didn't know when, they didn't know how, but they knew. You don't build a reputation like his and retire quietly. You don't live by fear and expect peace. You live fast, you burn bright, and you vanish. That was the pattern. That was the inevitability. The stories about Tommy still circulate today, decades after his disappearance. They're told in books, in movies, in interviews. But beneath the Hollywood sheen, beneath the Oscar-winning performance that immortalized him, the truth is darker. He was a young man whose temper made him feared, whose unpredictability made him infamous, and whose violence made him doomed. The reputation that made him powerful was the same one that signed his death warrant. And every story, every whispered tale of his rage, every nervous laugh at a card game, was another line in the prophecy of how he would vanish. Because in the Mafia, reputations don't just define you. They destroy you. And for Tommy DeSimone, the reputation of fear was already sealing his fate. Chapter 12, The Cost of Violence. It was the kind of night where every sound seemed louder, every shadow longer, every glance heavier with meaning. A car door slammed somewhere in the distance, echoing against the brick walls of Queens. Inside Robert's lounge, glasses clinked, cards slapped the table, and nervous laughter tried to disguise the truth that no one wanted to say out loud. They all knew it. Tommy DeSimone's violence was catching up to him. Not in rumors, not in whispers, but in blood. The Mafia had rules. They weren't written down in law books, but they carried more weight than any statute. One of the most sacred was clear and absolute. You do not kill a made man. Not without permission. Not without an order from above. It was the kind of line you didn't cross, because crossing it didn't just bring heat, it brought death. And Tommy had crossed it. Not once. Twice. The first was William Bentvena, better known as Billy Bats. A Gambino soldier who had already done time, already earned his button. He had the respect of his family, the protection of that invisible shield that came with being made. And yet, on a night of drinking and taunting, Tommy snapped. The beating was brutal, savage, and personal. The stabbing that followed wasn't business. It was vengeance. It was ego. It was Tommy's temper boiling over. But the moment that knife went in, the rules of Cosa Nostra snapped into place like a trap. Because killing Bats wasn't just murder. It was an insult to the Gambino family, one of the most powerful in New York. It was the kind of insult that had to be answered. And everyone knew it. The second was Ronald Giroux, a young Gambino associate who was close to John Gotti. The killing was reckless, hot-headed, and unnecessary. Some said it was over a fight. Others said it was over respect. Either way, it wasn't sanctioned. And it put Tommy in the crosshairs of another powerful man. Another crew that wouldn't forgive, wouldn't forget. 2 killings. 2 families insulted. 2 death sentences, even if no one said it out loud. Henry Hill would later describe how the crew knew Tommy's days were numbered. They didn't tell him, because in their world, you didn't say those things. You just carried the weight of the knowledge, like a stone in your chest. But they knew. Jimmy Burke knew. Paul Vario knew. Everyone could see it coming. Tommy was too wild, too reckless, too violent. And in the Mafia, violence without discipline wasn't strength, it was suicide. The irony was that Tommy thought he was climbing. He thought the murders, the fear, the reputation, were his ticket upward. He wanted to be made. That was the dream. That was the crown. To him, every violent act was proof that he was loyal, that he was fearless, that he belonged in the inner circle. He didn't see that each body he left behind was closing the door tighter and tighter on that dream. The cost of his violence wasn't just enemies, it was trust. Paul Vario used him, but never fully trusted him. Jimmy relied on him, but worried about his volatility. Even Henry, who admired him, admitted he was scared of what Tommy might do next. The crew walked with him, laughed with him, worked with him, but deep down, they knew he was a liability. Violence in the Mafia wasn't random. It was calculated. It was like chess, each move considered, each risk weighed. Tommy's violence was more like dice. He rolled them whenever he felt like it, and sometimes they came up deadly. That kind of recklessness might intimidate small-time hustlers, but to the bosses, it was dangerous in the wrong way. It attracted attention. It broke rules. And rules were the glue holding the fragile web of power together. What Tommy didn't see, or maybe didn't care to see, was that the Mafia wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving yourself with every trigger pull. It was about balance, about power, about maintaining the illusion of order. When he killed Bats, he didn't just silence a rival. He shook that order. He tore a hole in the fabric of Mafia politics. And the Mafia doesn't forgive holes. It patches them, usually with blood. The cost of his violence rippled beyond him. It put Jimmy in danger because Jimmy was his closest ally. It put Henry in danger because he was part of the crew. It put Robert's Lounge under a shadow because every man who drank there knew the Gambinos were watching. Fear spread, but this time it wasn't fear of Tommy. It was fear of the consequences. Fear that his fire would burn them all. And yet, Tommy didn't slow down. He laughed louder. He bragged bigger. He strutted through bars and lounges like nothing could touch him. He thought the whispers about being made were real. He thought the ceremony was waiting for him. The day he would finally stand in a room, prick his finger, and swear loyalty as his blood burned on the saint's card. He didn't see that the whispers were a trap. He didn't hear the shift in tone when men spoke about him. The way admiration had curdled into concern, the way fear had shifted into impatience. He didn't see that Paul Vario might have even played a part in sealing his fate, feeding the Gambinos information, letting them know that Tommy could be taken without blowback from the Lucchese side. Because sometimes, in that world, even your own family decides the cost of your violence is too high. The cost was also psychological. Living by violence meant living in paranoia. Tommy wouldn't have admitted it, but every man who lives that way feels it. The eyes in the bar that linger too long. The car that follows too closely. The phone that rings yet. He laughed. He joked. He pretended to be invincible. But deep down, he had to feel it. That creeping weight pressing on him, whispering that the end was coming. By late 1978, his reputation was a cage. Too feared to be trusted. Too violent to be controlled. Too reckless to be saved. He was a man running on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking louder with each passing week. The irony of Tommy's story is that his violence was both his weapon and his weakness. It made him feared. It gave him power. But in the end, it guaranteed his downfall. In the Mafia, you live by the gun, you die by the gun. Not as poetry, not as a cliché, but as the cold, hard truth written in blood across countless lives. The cost of his violence was his fate. His dream of being made wasn't a dream at all. It was a setup. A promise that would lure him into a room in January of 1979, make him believe he was finally ascending, and then close the door behind him forever. But on the nights before that moment, when he laughed with Henry and Jimmy, when he leaned back in his chair at Robert's Lounge, when he dreamed of the ceremony that would crown him, he didn't see it. He didn't hear the whispers. He didn't feel the trap tightening. All he knew was that he wanted more. All he believed was that violence was his ticket, and he couldn't see that violence had already written his ending. Chapter 13, The Air France Heist. It was a cold night in December of 1967 when a young crew of small-time gangsters pulled off one of the most audacious thefts at Kennedy Airport. A simple cargo terminal, a single unlocked door, and a mountain of money waiting inside. No one fired a shot. No one sounded an alarm. And yet, when it was over, close to $500,000 in cash had disappeared into the shadows of New York. It wasn't the biggest heist in mafia history, but it was the one that made reputations. For Tommy DeSimone, it was a sign that he was no longer just muscle. He was part of something larger, something hungrier, something that could change the way they all lived. That night didn't start with violence, but with patience. The crew had been watching the terminal for weeks, learning the rhythms of the guards, the shifts, the vulnerabilities. To most outsiders, an airport looked impenetrable, a fortress of fences and watchful eyes. But in the mafia world, nothing was impenetrable if you knew the right people, greased the right palms, or scared the right men. They had a man on the inside, a cargo worker who whispered where the money was, when it would arrive, and how easy it would be to take. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: a key to a locker, a bag of cash, a quick walk out the door. In the underworld, that kind of clean job was rare. Usually, scores involved guns, getaways, or blood. This one was different. It was almost civilized, almost surgical. But beneath the calm exterior, there was tension, because everyone involved knew that stealing from an international airline wasn't the same as hijacking a truck of cigarettes. This was a score that would put them on the radar of law enforcement, and worse, on the radar of rival crews. Henry Hill would later say it was Jimmy Burke who orchestrated the heist. Jimmy was the mastermind, the strategist, the man who saw opportunity where others only saw risk. But men like Jimmy needed soldiers. Men who would stand guard, keep things tight, and be ready if anything went wrong. That was where Tommy came in. Young, eager, and already carrying a reputation for violence. He was the kind of insurance Jimmy liked to have on a job. As they moved into position, the silence was suffocating. Every step across the terminal floor echoed like thunder in their ears. Tommy's hand twitched at his side, instinctively close to the grip of his weapon, though the plan didn't call for it. That was Tommy, always ready for chaos even in the calmest of plans. His heart raced, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. Violence gave him a rush, but so did the idea of easy money. And this was easy money. The locker opened with a simple turn of a key. Inside, stacked in neat bundles, was cash that smelled of ink and paper, freshly printed and still warm from the presses of overseas banks. $420,000 in untraceable bills, waiting like treasure in a chest. For a moment, they just stared. Even hardened men, used to scores and hustles, couldn't help but feel the electricity of that sight. It was more money than most working men would see in a lifetime, sitting there unguarded. In that moment, something shifted. They weren't just street hustlers anymore. They weren't just kids running nickel-and-dime jobs. They were thieves of a higher order, men capable of hitting institutions, men bold enough to take from giants. The Air France heist was more than a robbery. It was a declaration. Tommy carried the bags out like they were nothing more than groceries. The whole thing took minutes. No alarms. No guards raising rifles. No chase down the tarmac. Just a quiet walk into the night. But with every step, the weight of the money pressed heavier, not on his shoulders, but on his future. Because in their world, a score like that didn't just mean wealth. It meant power. And power always came with a price. The celebration afterward was raucous. Drinks flowed. Laughter roared. They were kings for the night. Young men with pockets full of money and the illusion that nothing could touch them. Tommy reveled in it. He had always been seen as the enforcer, the psycho, the loose cannon. But now, he was part of a job that was clever, profitable, and legendary. For a brief moment, he tasted the respect that came not from fear, but from success. But even as they celebrated, shadows were moving. The FBI began sniffing around, piecing together how such a brazen theft could happen under their noses. The Port Authority police asked questions. The airline tightened its security. And other crews, men from other families, listened to the whispers in bars and pool halls. Word traveled fast in that world, and the wrong word could be deadly. The Air France heist didn't make Tommy rich forever. Money like that never lasted. It was gambled away, spent on cars, blown in bars, lost in the endless cycle of greed that drove men like him. But what it gave him was more dangerous than money. It gave him confidence. It gave him the belief that he could take anything he wanted, that rules didn't apply, that life was one endless score waiting to be taken. That kind of thinking was gasoline on the fire of his violent nature. Because now, when Tommy walked into a room, he didn't just walk in as the tough kid from Brooklyn with a short fuse. He walked in as a man who had pulled off a legendary heist, who had stood beside Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill, who had stared down the fortress of Kennedy Airport and walked out richer. That kind of reputation was intoxicating. It made him feel untouchable. But in the Mafia, untouchable was an illusion. Every heist brought attention. Every score carried risk. The higher you climbed, the farther you had to fall. The Air France heist put Tommy on the path to bigger things, bigger money, bigger risks. But it also put him on the path to the Lufthansa heist a decade later, and with it, the paranoia, betrayals, and blood that would consume the crew. In hindsight, the Air France job was almost too clean, too easy. It gave them a taste of something that didn't exist in their world, crime without consequence. And once you tasted that, you spent the rest of your life chasing it, never realizing that sooner or later, the consequences always caught up. For Tommy, the heist was a stepping stone, a moment that transformed him from a soldier into a player. But even as he held that money in his hands, even as he laughed and toasted to their success, the same question lingered in the shadows of the lounge, in the corners of his mind, and in the unspoken glances of his partners. If it was this easy to take so much, what would they dare to take next? And how long before someone, somewhere, decided that the cost of ambition was too high? Chapter 14. The Lufthansa Heist Setup. December of 1978. A bitter winter wind howled across the tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport, rattling the chain-link fences and whispering through the hangars like a warning no one could hear. Inside one of those hangars, locked away in a supposedly secure cargo facility, sat millions of dollars in cash. Money from West Germany, flown into New York to be exchanged and distributed. Money that had passed through banks and governments. Money that seemed untouchable. But in the underworld, nothing was untouchable. For months, whispers had circled through bars and lounges, the kind of whispers men leaned in close to hear and never repeated outside the right company. A fortune was sitting there, guarded only by routine and trust. And for a man like Jimmy Burke, those two things, routine and trust, were nothing but weaknesses waiting to be broken. He saw opportunity where others saw walls. He was the architect of the plan, the strategist who could spot a soft spot in the armor of giants. The idea of the Lufthansa score was intoxicating, almost unbelievable. Nearly $6 million in untraceable cash, stacked and waiting in a room no bigger than a storage shed. Alongside it, jewelry worth nearly $1 million more. To ordinary men, it sounded like fantasy. To mobsters hardened by years of hustles and hijackings, it sounded like destiny. But even in their world, this was different. Truck hijackings, loan sharking, shakedowns, those were steady money, the lifeblood of crews like Burke's. Lufthansa was something else. It wasn't just a score, it was a chance to step into legend. But legends had a price, and everyone knew that a heist of this size would ripple far beyond the airport walls. It would rattle the police, the FBI, and even the mafia families who didn't have a piece of the action. One wrong move, one loose tongue, and the job wouldn't just collapse. It would bury every man involved. Tommy DeSimone felt the electricity of it from the start. He had been at Burke's side for years, the volatile enforcer who could be counted on when fear needed to be put into someone's bones. But Lufthansa wasn't a job solved with fists or guns alone. It demanded discipline, timing, and secrecy, qualities Tommy didn't always possess. Yet Burke trusted him. He saw Tommy as a necessary piece on the board, a soldier whose sheer presence could keep others in line. The setup unfolded slowly, with the patience of hunters stalking prey. An airport worker, desperate for money, whispered the details. Shift schedules, the delivery times, the weak spots in security. Every secret traded in confidence brought the job closer to reality. For months, the crew studied the building, The guards, the paths in and out. They drove past in the night, walked the grounds, memorized every shadow. To outsiders, they were nobodies leaning on bar counters or hanging out in smoke-filled lounges. But behind closed doors, maps were spread, watches were timed, and a plan was carved sharp as a blade. It was simple on paper. Strike just before dawn, when the guards were tired and the air was frozen with routine. Hold them at gunpoint. Force them to open the vault. Load the cash. Disappear into the night. The beauty of it was in its precision. The risk, though, was in its scale. Millions of dollars wasn't just theft, it was provocation. And in the mafia world, provocation could mean death sentences handed out without hesitation. As December crept closer, tension in the crew thickened. Every man played his role, but every man also nursed his own private fears. Fear of being caught, fear of betrayal, fear of what would happen if Jimmy decided someone knew too much. For Tommy, fear wasn't in his vocabulary. He thrived on chaos, leaned into danger like it was a lover whispering in his ear. He laughed when others grew tense. He joked when others kept silent. It wasn't courage, it was recklessness, the same recklessness that made him both valuable and dangerous. The night of the job arrived cold and still. The world outside slept, unaware that history was about to be written in shadows. Vans rolled quietly toward the airport, headlights dimmed, engines humming low like a predator's growl. Inside, men adjusted masks, checked weapons, and swallowed the dryness in their throats. Tommy sat among them, restless energy pouring from his body, like a fuse burning toward dynamite. He had always loved the moment before violence, the stretch of silence when anything could happen. They slipped through the gates, their movements rehearsed until they felt like instinct. Guns flashed, orders barked. The guards froze, fear flooding their eyes. One wrong twitch, one scream, and blood would have painted the concrete. But discipline held. Burke had drilled it into them. This was business, not carnage. They weren't here to kill, they were here to take. The vault opened, and there it was, mountains of cash stacked in crates, glinting like something out of a dream. The air seemed heavier in that room, as though the weight of the money pressed down on everyone's shoulders. For a moment, even hardened criminals felt awe. $6 million. More than they had ever seen, more than they had ever touched. Enough to vanish into new lives, enough to drown in greed. They worked quickly, loading bags, moving with precision. Minutes felt like hours, each second dragging under the pressure of possibility. Outside, the winter wind rattled doors and fences, and every sound threatened to shatter their nerves. Tommy grinned through it all, exhilarated, like a man watching fireworks explode above his head. To him, this wasn't just theft, it was victory, proof that he belonged in the world of legends. When the vans rolled away, the airport returned to silence. Behind them, guards lay bound and gagged, their hearts pounding in their ears. Ahead of them, millions sat in bags that smelled of ink and opportunity. They had done it. Against all odds, against all reason, they had pulled off the largest cash robbery in American history. But success in their world was never clean. It was never simple. As the vans disappeared into the night, so did their control. The score was too big, too loud, too tempting. Greed would spread through the crew like a disease. Paranoia would follow, whispering in every dark corner. And in that paranoia, men like Tommy, violent, unpredictable, uncontrollable, would either be feared or eliminated. The Lufthansa heist wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the unraveling. Millions stolen in silence, but a storm of blood waiting just around the corner. Tommy couldn't see it yet, blinded by the thrill of the score, his hands still tingling from the weight of the money. But history would see it clearly. This was the night that sealed his fate. Because in the mafia, the bigger the score, the bigger the shadow it cast. And shadows always hid knives. Chapter 15. Tommy's role in Lufthansa. The night after the Lufthansa heist, Brooklyn buzzed with the kind of whispers that only travel in shadows. Nobody could say for sure who had pulled it off, but everybody felt the tremors. $6 million had vanished like smoke, and the city's underworld knew that sort of magic didn't happen without Jimmy Burke's fingerprints somewhere on it. In the middle of those whispers, walking with a swagger that was half confidence and half madness, was Tommy DeSimone. Tommy wasn't the mastermind. He didn't draw the maps or grease the right palms. That wasn't who he was. He was a soldier, pure and simple. A man built for action, for the moments when violence wasn't an option but a necessity. In the orbit of men like Jimmy Burke, Tommy was both a weapon and a warning. You didn't cross Jimmy because men like Tommy stood behind him, restless, eager, unpredictable. That's what made Tommy's presence around the Lufthansa score so dangerous. He didn't have the discipline of a planner, but he had the recklessness of someone who couldn't see the cliff until he was already falling. For a job like Lufthansa, recklessness was both an asset and a liability. Tommy's role in the heist was never entirely clear. He wasn't one of the masked men hauling cash across the tarmac. He wasn't inside the vault, staring at mountains of unmarked bills. But he was there in the planning stages, lingering at Robert's lounge, throwing in ideas, cracking jokes that made others laugh nervously. He was the kind of man you brought close enough to scare people, but not close enough to touch the crown jewels. Still, just being near the score put him in rarefied air, the kind of company most wise guys dreamed about. Tommy loved it. For once, he wasn't just the hothead with the short fuse, the guy who cracked skulls over insults. He was part of something that would be remembered, something whispered about for decades. He bragged without saying a word, his chest puffed a little higher, his smile curling at the edges with smug satisfaction. Everyone around him could feel it. Tommy thought Lufthansa had changed his place in the pecking order. But the truth was, the job had changed nothing. Tommy was still Tommy. He hadn't planned it, hadn't controlled it, hadn't dictated who lived and who died if things went wrong. He was still the soldier who did what he was told. But in his mind, Lufthansa was proof that he belonged in the inner circle. That delusion would cost him more than he ever imagined. In the days following the score, paranoia spread like wildfire. Jimmy Burke's brilliance wasn't in pulling off a heist. It was in keeping it quiet afterward. He knew the heat would come down hard, and the only way to survive was discipline. No spending, no talking, no showing off. Lay low, stay invisible, let the city forget. But Tommy was incapable of invisibility. He wanted the world to feel his presence, to know he was dangerous, to sense that something about him was untouchable. He strutted into bars and lounges with the glow of a man who thought he'd struck gold. Even if he didn't flash the money, his attitude gave him away. In a world where silence was survival, Tommy's swagger was a death sentence. Others in the crew saw it too. They saw the way his eyes lit up when Lufthansa came up in conversation, the way he leaned in too eagerly when men whispered about the score. He was a live wire, sparking too close to gasoline. And in the Mafia, live wires weren't tolerated for long. The irony was that Tommy didn't even need the Lufthansa score. He had always made his bones the old way, through violence, intimidation, and fear. Lufthansa was a jackpot for Jimmy Burke, a chance to carve his name into history. For Tommy, it was little more than proximity. He was orbiting greatness, not creating it. But that orbit fed his ego, and an inflated ego was as deadly in the Mafia as a bullet to the head. The aftermath of the heist painted the picture clearly. Men began disappearing, one by one, associates who had been too loose with their money or too sloppy with their mouths. They turned up in trunks, buried in shallow graves, or simply vanished without a trace. Jimmy Burke was cleaning house, pruning the branches before the whole tree was burned down. Tommy thought he was safe. He believed his closeness to Jimmy made him untouchable, that his role as enforcer put him above suspicion. But paranoia doesn't distinguish between masterminds and muscle. It doesn't care about loyalty or history. In the aftermath of Lufthansa, paranoia was law, and Tommy was breaking it every time he walked into a room grinning. There were whispers that Tommy wanted more from the job too, that he believed his cut should be bigger, that his role deserved more recognition. Maybe he said it out loud, maybe he didn't. In the Mafia, perception mattered more than truth, and the perception of greed was often punished with finality. For men like Henry Hill, who watched from the periphery, Tommy's behavior was terrifying. Henry knew the code, knew the delicate balance between ambition and survival. He could see that Tommy was leaning too far into ambition, forgetting that survival required silence. Henry later described Tommy as a time bomb, always ticking, always threatening to go off when you least expect it. Around Lufthansa, that ticking grew louder, echoing in the ears of everyone who valued their lives. The cruelest part of Tommy's story was that he was never meant to be more than muscle. He was the kind of man who kept others in line, who made debtors pay, who turned whispers into silence with a flash of his temper. But standing too close to Lufthansa made him believe he was more than that. It blurred the line between soldier and boss in his own head, and once that line blurred, there was no coming back. The Mafia thrived on hierarchy. It was built like a pyramid, with the boss at the top and soldiers at the bottom, each man knowing his place, each man punished when he forgot it. Tommy forgot. Worse, Tommy flaunted his forgetfulness, strutting like a man who thought he could skip steps on the ladder. In that world, skipping steps didn't get you to the top, it got you buried. By Christmas of 1978, just weeks after the score, the paranoia around Lufthansa was suffocating. The FBI was swarming. Detectives worked overtime, following leads, tapping phones, leaning on informants. Jimmy Burke paced like a general at war, constantly calculating who was safe, who was sloppy, and who needed to be erased. Tommy still smiled, still cracked jokes, still acted like nothing could touch him. But men who laughed in that world often didn't laugh for long. His role in Lufthansa was never written in blood on the tarmac. It was written in whispers, in barroom shadows, in the uneasy glances of men who knew discipline was survival. Tommy didn't understand that kind of discipline. He never had. And in the aftermath of the largest score in American history, that ignorance was a death sentence waiting to be delivered. The heist had made legends, but it had also painted targets. And Tommy DeSimone, with his restless grin and his reckless pride, had painted the brightest one of all on his own back. In the world of organized crime, survival wasn't just about power. It was about knowing when to keep your head down. And Tommy never kept his head down. Which is why, as the new year dawned and bodies kept piling up, everyone watching from the sidelines knew one thing. Tommy's turn was coming. The only question was when. Chapter 16, Paranoia and Bloodshed. It began with silence. Not the kind of silence that comes after a loud night of laughter, but the suffocating kind, where voices vanish and eyes shift nervously in dimly lit corners. In the weeks after the Lufthansa heist, Brooklyn's air felt heavier. Men who once bragged at bars stopped showing up. Associates who had been seen counting rolls of cash disappeared into the night and never returned. And underneath it all was an unspoken truth. Jimmy Burke was pruning his garden, cutting away every branch that looked like it might bring heat to the score of a lifetime. For Tommy DeSimone, that silence was both familiar and dangerous. He had always lived in chaos, thrived in it even. But now, the chaos was different. It wasn't the predictable kind that came with barroom fights or street shakedowns. This was a creeping paranoia, the kind that made men second-guess every handshake, every phone call, every smile. And paranoia in the mafia world was like a virus. It spread fast, killed without warning, and left no survivors who spoke out loud. The disappearances began almost casually. One man flashed a brand new car when everyone had been told to stay quiet, to act broke. Days later, he was gone. Another couldn't resist buying his wife a fur coat. He vanished too, his body never found. It was a pattern as ruthless as clockwork. Spend, brag, disappear. And with every vanishing act, the rest of the crew grew more tense. They whispered less. They laughed softer. They watched each other with eyes that betrayed suspicion. Tommy wasn't built for that kind of tension. He had always been the wild card, the man who solved problems with his fists, with bullets, with brute force. But now the problem wasn't an enemy on the street. It was the men sitting next to him. Men who, yesterday, had been brothers. Today, they might be dead weight. Tomorrow, they might be dead. Tommy's reputation made things worse. He was already seen as a liability, a man too quick with his temper, too unpredictable to trust with delicate business. Lufthansa was the kind of score that demanded discipline, silence, patience. Tommy had none of those things. He strutted into bars with that restless grin, the kind that said he knew something others didn't. It made men uneasy. Uneasy men talk. And in the Mafia, talk could kill as surely as a bullet. The truth was, Jimmy Burke's paranoia wasn't unfounded. The FBI was circling like vultures. Detectives worked shifts around the clock, tapping phones, watching cars, following wives and girlfriends. The heist had been too big, too bold, too public. $6 million doesn't just vanish without the world noticing. And Burke knew that if anyone cracked under pressure, the entire empire would crumble. That's why he started cutting. It wasn't about personal grudges, it was survival. Better to bury an associate than let one slip and bring down the whole crew. But Tommy didn't understand that kind of chess game. He wasn't a strategist. He saw things in black and white, alive or dead, respect or insult, loyalty or betrayal. And in a world painted in shades of gray, Tommy's worldview was poison. Men noticed how he handled the tension too. Where others grew quieter, Tommy grew louder. Where others hid, Tommy leaned in. He cracked jokes about bodies, about how men had disappeared. He laughed when others felt their throats tighten. It was his way of showing dominance, of proving he wasn't afraid. But to those around him, it wasn't dominance, it was recklessness. The paranoia reached its peak when Tommy started making enemies inside his own circle. Old grudges resurfaced. Words he had shouted in drunken rage came back to haunt him. Even small things, an insult, a shove, a glare, felt heavier now, like sparks near dry gasoline. And Tommy had sparked too many times. Henry Hill would later recall how walking into Robert's lounge felt like stepping into a coffin. The air was thick with suspicion. Every man sat as if waiting for the bullet that would end him. Tommy, though, never seemed to notice. Or maybe he noticed and didn't care. He leaned back in his chair, laughed too loud, sipped his drink like nothing could touch him. That act alone was enough to make others believe he was already marked. Then came the whispers that Tommy was a problem even Burke couldn't control. Too violent, too sloppy, too unpredictable. Some claimed he bragged too much about Lufthansa. Others said it wasn't Lufthansa at all, but old sins catching up to him. Murders he had committed that broke the most sacred rules of the Mafia. One name kept coming up, Billy Batts. Killing a made man was unforgivable, and Tommy had done it without hesitation. Maybe Lufthansa only accelerated what was already decided, that Tommy DeSimone was living on borrowed time. The irony of it all was brutal. Tommy had lived his life by violence, built his reputation on fear. But in the end, it was that same reputation that painted him as expendable. A man too feared to be trusted, too dangerous to be kept alive. In the Mafia, fear was a weapon, but it was also a curse. The men who rose too high on fear alone often didn't last long. The bodies kept piling up. Cars abandoned at airports, men stuffed into garbage trucks, shallow graves dug in forgotten lots. Each death was a reminder. Lufthansa hadn't been a victory, it was a curse. A jackpot that had turned into a death sentence for everyone who touched it. And Tommy, with his short fuse and restless grin, was standing in the middle of the storm. Some nights, when the barroom grew quiet and the laughter died, men swore they saw a flicker in Tommy's eyes. Not fear, exactly, but something close to it. Maybe he knew, deep down, that the walls were closing in. Maybe he felt the noose tightening with every disappearance. Or maybe he just didn't care anymore. After all, Tommy had always lived as if tomorrow wasn't promised. For him, maybe it never was. The tension finally became unbearable. Burke was still pulling the strings, still deciding who lived and who didn't. But the whispers around Tommy grew louder. He was too much of a liability. His violence wasn't protection anymore. It was a spotlight, shining directly on the crew at the worst possible moment. And in a world where survival meant invisibility, Tommy DeSimone was a man who refused to disappear. The silence that had begun after Lufthansa was now deafening. Men had stopped asking where their friends had gone. They already knew the answer. And Tommy? He walked into that silence like a man whistling through a graveyard, pretending not to see the headstones lining the path. But everyone else saw them. And everyone else knew. The bloodshed wasn't finished. The paranoia hadn't run its course. And Tommy DeSimone, with his laughter and his violence, was standing closer and closer to the edge. The only question left hanging in the smoke-filled air was this. When the time came, would Tommy see it coming? Or would the end arrive as sudden as the violence he had unleashed on so many others? Chapter 17. The Gambino Vendetta. It had been years since the murder, but in the Mafia, years meant nothing. Time didn't heal wounds. It only kept them raw beneath the surface, festering, waiting for the moment of revenge. And for the Gambinos, one wound cut deeper than most. William Billy Batts Bentvena, a made man, a soldier in good standing, had been slaughtered in a fit of rage by Tommy DeSimone. In the underworld, that act wasn't just reckless. It was unforgivable. Tommy had thought he got away with it. He had buried Batts in a shallow grave, then moved the body later when construction threatened to uncover the secret. For a while, the silence held, as if the night of blood had vanished into the past. But the Mafia doesn't forget. It keeps score, like a bookie writing down debts in a little black ledger. And Tommy's debt to the Gambinos was written in blood, underlined, and never erased. The thing about killing a made man is simple. It's like setting fire to a church. It doesn't matter why you did it, or whether you had a good reason. You crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. A made man wasn't just another gangster. He was protected by an oath, by tradition, by the weight of history itself. Touch him without permission, and you weren't just making an enemy of a person. You were making an enemy of an entire family. And Tommy, wild and fearless, had done just that. For the Gambinos, revenge wasn't about passion or anger anymore. It was about balance. The Mafia runs on rules, and those rules are enforced with the sharp edge of consequence. If Batts could be killed without payback, then the system itself would fracture. And so, as the years rolled on, as Tommy laughed in bars and swaggered through life, a shadow followed him quietly. He didn't see it, but others did. Whispers grew. Rumors tightened. A storm was gathering, and everyone seemed to know it except Tommy himself. The men closest to him, Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, understood what was happening. They knew Tommy's reckless act had signed his death warrant. But in that world, you didn't tell a man his end was coming. You didn't warn him, because maybe you'd be the one asked to deliver him. Silence was survival. And so they smiled, drank, joked, while privately wondering how long before the Gambinos struck. The vendetta was patient. Vengeance in the Mafia didn't need to be rushed. It was deliberate, like a chess game where every move was measured, every piece sacrificed with purpose. The Gambinos bided their time, waiting for the right moment to even the score. They knew Tommy's volatility would eventually place him within reach. And when that day came, they would not hesitate. Tommy's reputation only sharpened the Gambinos' hunger for justice. Stories spread of him killing Spider, of beating men over insults, of laughing at violence like it was a sport. To outsiders, he was a psycho, a time bomb ticking toward disaster. To the Gambinos, he was a stain that had to be wiped clean. His very existence was an insult to their authority, a constant reminder of bats rotting in the ground. The vendetta was more than personal. It was political. Batts had been a friend of John Gotti, a rising power in the Gambino family. In Mafia terms, that meant Tommy hadn't just killed a soldier, he had insulted a future boss. And Gotti was not the kind of man to forgive or forget. His pride demanded payback, and his pride carried the weight of an entire empire. By the late 1970s, after Lufthansa, Tommy was already marked as reckless. He was too visible, too violent, too loud. To the Lucchese family, he was both an asset and a liability. To the Gambinos, he was unfinished business. And it didn't matter how many truckloads he hijacked or how loyal he was to Jimmy Burke. None of that could erase the night Batts was stomped, beaten, and left for dead. There were nights when Tommy, drunk and loud, would still laugh about the killing. He'd talk about it like it was just another score, another story to brag over. That arrogance was gasoline on the fire. Every word, every smirk, every careless retelling pushed him closer to the edge. Men who heard him speak lowered their eyes. knowing that those words, like sparks, might ignite the inevitable. The Gambino vendetta wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a promise. Everyone in the underworld knew it. They knew Tommy's days were numbered, that his swaggering walk and quick temper were only masking the ticking clock above his head. But Tommy either didn't care or didn't believe. Maybe he thought Jimmy Burke's protection or Paul Vario's shield was enough. Maybe he believed fear would keep him alive, just as it had all his life. But fear doesn't stop vendettas. Vendettas end in blood. It's said that in those final weeks, the whispers grew louder. Meetings in dark rooms, conversations hushed when Tommy walked in, phone calls that ended abruptly. He might have felt it in the pit of his stomach, the sense that something was closing in. But if he did, he never showed it. He carried on as though immortal, as though violence could never turn back on him. That was Tommy's greatest illusion, believing he was the predator when, all along, he was being hunted. The Mafia's rules are unforgiving. They don't bend for personality. They don't break for charisma. Tommy DeSimone had crossed one of the oldest rules written in blood. The Gambinos hadn't forgotten. They hadn't forgiven. They were waiting. And the longer they waited, the closer the noose drew around Tommy's neck. The vendetta was no longer just about bats. It was about the order of things, about the principle that no man, no matter how feared, could murder a made soldier without consequence. Tommy had become a living reminder of that rule broken, a crack in the foundation. And in the Mafia, cracks don't last long. They are filled, sealed, or destroyed. Every smile, every drink, every night Tommy spent laughing in Robert's lounge was shadowed by that unspoken truth. The Gambinos would have their justice. The only question was when. And as the nights grew darker, as more bodies vanished and more whispers spread, one thing became undeniable. Tommy DeSimone's time was running out. The vendetta was coming for him. But would he see it before it struck, or would his end arrive in the same way he had delivered it to so many others, sudden, brutal, and without mercy? Chapter 18, The Mafia Code. The rule was clear, ancient, and unbreakable. A made man was untouchable. Killing one without permission wasn't just reckless. It was a death sentence, guaranteed, inevitable. And yet Tommy DeSimone had done it. Imagine a sacred law written not on paper, but in blood and fear, passed down through whispered oaths in smoke-filled back rooms. The Mafia wasn't simply a gang. It was a brotherhood, older than most of the men who served it, rooted in centuries of Sicilian tradition. At its core was the ritual of making a man, the sacred ceremony that elevated him above associates, above common criminals, into a world where loyalty was absolute. Once you were made, you belonged to the family in a way that was both protective and suffocating. You were untouchable, and your blood was theirs. To kill a made man without permission was like spitting on the church altar during Mass. It wasn't only an act of violence, it was sacrilege. The Mafia was built on power, but that power relied on rules. Break the rules, and everything crumbled. That was why the punishment was so severe. There could be no exceptions, no leniency, no forgiveness. When William "Billy" Batts Bentveena's body was stuffed into a car trunk and dumped into the ground, the echoes of that decision rippled through the underworld. Everyone knew what it meant. Tommy DeSimone had stepped onto sacred ground with muddy boots. He had defied the very code that kept the Mafia from devouring itself. And because of that, his fate had already been written. The ceremony of becoming a made man explains why. Picture a small, dimly lit room. A saint's card in one hand, a needle-pricked finger dripping blood in the other. An oath whispered as the card burns, flames licking up like the fire of eternal damnation. The promise is simple: loyalty until death. Family above everything. Obedience without question. It is a rebirth of sorts, where the man becomes less than an individual and more a piece of something eternal. And once you are made, you carry the weight of every brother who came before you. Killing you is like killing the family itself. That was the line Tommy had crossed. He had not only murdered a man, he had insulted the oath, desecrated the ceremony, and spit in the face of an entire empire. It didn't matter that Batts had mouthed off. Didn't matter that he had humiliated Tommy in a bar full of people. pride didn't outweigh the code. In the Mafia, emotions are a weakness. Rules are everything. But Tommy was never one for rules. He lived by his own pulse, his own anger, his own reckless need to prove himself. For him, Bat's death was just another notch in the belt, another night of blood that made him feel untouchable. What he didn't understand was that by killing Bats, he had handed the Gambino family a loaded gun and pointed it directly at his own head. The Mafia code was enforced not only by fear, but by necessity. Think of it as the spine of the beast. Without the rules, the body collapses. If a soldier could be killed without consequence, what protection did the oath offer? What worth did a man's word have? The entire system depended on revenge as justice. And that's why, no matter how many friends Tommy had in the Lucchese family, no matter how useful he was to Jimmy Burke, there could be no protection strong enough. He had broken the one law that nobody could survive breaking. The men around him knew it. Henry Hill later admitted that everyone in Robert's lounge understood Tommy was finished from the moment Bats went into the ground. They didn't need to say it out loud. They could feel it in the way men spoke less when Tommy was around, in the way the room went quiet when his laughter got too loud. It was like watching a man with a target painted on his back, walking boldly through life, not realizing every step was drawing him closer to the trigger. The irony was bitter. Tommy had killed Bats for disrespect, for the humiliation of being told to shine shoes like a punk kid. He wanted to be respected, feared, recognized as a true force in the underworld. But that one moment of rage did the opposite. It sealed him as reckless, unhinged, and doomed. He had proven he could be violent, yes, but also uncontrollable. And in the Mafia, a man without control was more dangerous to his own side than to his enemies. There is a strange poetry in the way the code functioned. To an outsider, it might look barbaric, archaic, a blood-soaked tradition that glorified death. But within the Mafia, it was order. Like gravity, it kept everything from flying apart. A soldier knew that if he took the oath, the family would protect him with its full weight. That protection was sacred. If someone broke it, the punishment had to be absolute, or else the promise was empty. Tommy's crime wasn't simply murder. It was destabilization. It was like drilling a hole in the hull of a ship while still at sea. The family could not allow it to stand. And so, his days were numbered. It's important to understand how men like Tommy thought. They lived fast, with a gambler's arrogance, betting on each day as if tomorrow wasn't promised. In truth, for many of them, it wasn't. They thrived on risk, on chaos, on the adrenaline of breaking rules and surviving anyway. But the Mafia wasn't chaos. It was structure pretending to be chaos. And the structure always won. The vendetta against Tommy wasn't about vengeance alone. It was about restoring balance. Every time a soldier looked at Bat's empty chair, every time John Gotti heard Tommy's name, the imbalance screamed louder. The scales had to be corrected, and the correction would come not with warnings, not with negotiations, but with a bullet to the head. That was the Mafia's way. The code wasn't flexible. It wasn't forgiving. It didn't allow for heat of the moment, or he didn't mean it. In the Mafia, meaning doesn't matter. Action does. And Tommy's action had carved his fate into stone. Some men, years later, would look back and shake their heads, saying Tommy never truly understood the weight of what he'd done. Maybe he didn't believe the Gambinos would dare strike back at someone under the wing of Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario. Maybe he thought his reputation for violence made him too dangerous to touch. But the code doesn't care about reputations. It doesn't bend to personality. It bends only to the rules. In that world, death was the ultimate enforcer. You break the rules, you pay with your life. It was simple, brutal, effective. And Tommy had broken the biggest rule of all. The clock was ticking from the moment Bat's blood hit the floor. Every laugh, every job, every drink afterward was just a delay of the inevitable. He might have felt untouchable, but the truth was written in every whisper around him. His time was running out. And when the Gambinos finally came for him, it wouldn't be quick, it wouldn't be merciful. It would be justice by their code, justice as old as the Mafia itself. The only question left was when. And that question hung in the air like a blade, waiting to drop. Chapter 19. a false promise. The phone rang in the middle of the night, the kind of ring that doesn't just wake you. It jolts you upright, the sound sharp, like a knock at the door of fate itself. On the other end came the words Tommy DeSimone had been waiting his whole life to hear. He was finally going to be made. For an associate in the Mafia, those words were more than an invitation. They were the key to immortality. To be made was to cross the invisible line between hustler and untouchable. No more playing second fiddle. No more worrying about being left behind. You weren't just a street soldier anymore. You were family, protected by the code, your blood woven into the fabric of La Cosa Nostra. For Tommy, it was everything. His temper, his violence, his constant need to prove himself, it had all been leading here. But there was a problem hidden beneath the promise, a shadow curled around the edges of it. A truth Tommy couldn't see, or maybe refused to see. That night, when the phone clicked silent, his fate had already been sealed. The offer wasn't salvation. It was a setup. Tommy had wanted this moment for years. He had lived like a storm, reckless and violent, but always with one goal in the back of his mind: recognition. In his world, respect wasn't earned by money alone or by fear. True respect came with the ceremony of becoming a made man. And that respect, once given, could never be taken away. Or so he thought. It is easy to understand why this mattered so deeply to him. Growing up, he had been the hot-headed kid in the corner, fighting for scraps of approval, always the one with too much to prove. The Mafia gave him an outlet, a stage where violence wasn't just tolerated, it was valued. But even within that world, there was a ceiling. Associates could make money, carry out jobs, even kill when told. But without the ceremony, they would always remain on the outside looking in. That's what made the phone call sound like a dream. The ceremony was secretive, almost mystical. Few knew the exact details, but the whispers painted a vivid picture. A saint's card would burn in your hands, its ashes falling like the weight of an oath. Blood would be drawn, binding you to the family for life. Your loyalty would be tested with words as old as Sicily itself, and once you repeated them, you were no longer your own man. You belonged to the Mafia. For Tommy, the promise of that transformation meant everything. It was the validation he had been clawing toward, the proof that his violence, his chaos, his very nature had been worth something. He told friends he was nervous but excited, that this was the day his life truly began. He didn't see the way others went quiet when he spoke, didn't notice the sidelong glances exchanged in silence. They already knew what he didn't. He was walking into his own funeral. It's important to understand why the promise worked so well. In the Mafia, ambition wasn't just common, it was necessary. Every man dreamed of rising higher, of proving himself, of earning the respect that came with blood membership. Men waited decades for the honor, some never receiving it at all. For Tommy, who was still in his 20s, the offer seemed like a miracle. But ambition can blind a man to danger. It can make a noose look like a crown. The irony was brutal. Tommy thought he was about to be protected by the code. In reality, the code was the very reason he had to die. He had killed a made man without permission, and the only way to restore balance was to sacrifice him. The Gambinos wanted blood, and the Lucchese's, bound by tradition, couldn't shield him. So they gave him what he wanted most: the illusion of belonging, the chance to walk into the ceremony he had dreamed of. Only this ceremony wouldn't end with an oath. It would end with a bullet. That night, as he prepared himself, you can almost imagine the fire inside him. He probably straightened his clothes a little sharper, walked a little taller, replayed the words in his head: made man, made man. Every step he took was filled with a confidence that only deepened the tragedy. He was blind to the truth, marching into the jaws of a ritual that had been twisted into his execution. There's something almost Shakespearean about it. The man who wanted respect so desperately that he couldn't see he was already marked. He was walking into a room not to be reborn, but to be erased. It was as if the very dream he had lived for became the trap that swallowed him whole. And yet, he wasn't the only one fooled. Even Henry Hill, his closest friend, believed it at first. When word spread that Tommy was going to be made, Hill and Jimmy Burke celebrated. They drank, they laughed, they toasted to Tommy's future. To them, This was a victory. Having a man on the inside meant protection, power, influence. None of them suspected the truth, not then. But the silence of the night told a different story. The way no fanfare surrounded the event. The way Tommy was told to show up quietly, without ceremony, without even his friends by his side. In hindsight, the warning signs were everywhere. But when ambition burns hot enough, it blinds the eyes to smoke until it's too late. The Mafia was skilled at deception. They knew that hope could be sharper than fear, that the promise of power could lure a man into places he would otherwise never walk. For Tommy, it worked perfectly. They dangled the dream in front of him, and he followed without hesitation, never looking back, never asking the one question that could have saved him. Why now? Because the truth was, the timing made no sense. Tommy had been violent for years, unpredictable, reckless. He wasn't the kind of man the Mafia usually promoted. Made men were chosen for loyalty, discipline, and control. Tommy had none of those. But he was too caught up in his own hunger to see it. He believed the promise because he needed to believe it. He believed it because the dream was the only thing he had left to chase. And so he walked into the trap with open arms. The tragedy of that moment is that Tommy was already doomed, no matter what. Whether he had refused, whether he had asked questions, whether he had disappeared into the night, it wouldn't have mattered. The Gambinos hadn't forgotten Billy Bats, and they never would. The only choice left was how Tommy's end would come. And the Mafia, with its old, merciless code, chose to give him the cruelest ending of all, to make him believe, up until the very last second, that he was finally being accepted. It was a false promise, and it worked like a charm. As he prepared for that final meeting, Tommy couldn't have known that the dream he clung to had already been twisted into his death sentence. He couldn't have known that behind the promise of blood and loyalty waited only betrayal. And when the door closed behind him, when the silence grew heavy, when the men he trusted stood too close, too still, that was the moment the truth revealed itself. The dream was over. The ceremony he longed for would never come. And as the first shadow of violence fell over him, the last thought that might have crossed his mind was the cruelest one of all. He had finally gotten everything he ever wanted. Everything except tomorrow. Chapter 20. Walking into the Trap. The winter air in New York has a way of cutting through even the thickest coat, a sharp reminder that the city itself can be as cold as the men who rule its streets. On the morning of January 14th, 1979, Tommy DeSimone stepped into that air with a strange mix of nerves and pride burning in his chest. He believed this was the day his life changed forever. The day he stopped being an outsider and finally crossed into the inner circle of La Cosa Nostra. Every story about that morning suggests the same thing. Tommy was excited. He had told his wife, in passing, that something important was happening. He had hinted to friends that this was his shot, his moment. The energy around him was like a man preparing for a coronation, not a funeral. That's the cruel trick of it all. He didn't know that by the time the sun set, he would vanish from the world, never to be seen alive again. The promise of being made had haunted Tommy for years. He wanted it more than money, more than comfort, more than safety. To him, it was like being knighted, like stepping onto a throne carved out of loyalty and fear. Men who were made carried themselves differently. They moved with the confidence of knowing the rules no longer applied to them. To Tommy, that was everything. It was immortality on the streets. And so he got dressed carefully that morning, sharper than usual. There was a sense of ceremony to it, even if he didn't say it out loud. The phone call had been brief, the instructions simple. Come alone, come ready. He didn't hesitate. He didn't question. That's the part that makes it sting, the silence of his trust. In the Mafia, a single doubt can keep you alive. But Tommy had no doubts. The drive itself must have been tense, though he likely masked it with bravado. The car humming along icy roads, exhaust curling into the brittle winter air. Maybe he lit a cigarette. Maybe he rehearsed what he might say during the ceremony. Maybe he pictured the look on Jimmy Burke's face when he came back as a made man. In his mind, this was a victory march. But beneath the surface, the city whispered a different story. His enemies had not forgotten. The Gambinos were patient, and the Mafia code was merciless. Killing a made man without permission was a sin that could not be ignored, and Tommy had committed it in the most brutal way possible. That morning, as he walked toward what he thought was honor, the very act of believing in the ceremony sealed his fate. Picture the moment he arrived. The building plain, unassuming, like so many mafia haunts scattered across Brooklyn and Queens. No banners, no celebrations, no sign of the sacred rite he imagined. Just a door, heavy and waiting, and men who had already rehearsed the part they would play. Walking through that door must have felt like stepping into destiny. He couldn't have known it was a coffin disguised as a threshold. His shoes clicked on the floor, each step echoing louder than the last. He might have smiled, greeted the faces he recognized, not realizing that the warmth in their voices was a mask stretched tight over betrayal. The mafia was good at theater. They knew how to stage a moment, how to dress it in ritual, how to make a man feel safe right up until the second the world turned against him. For Tommy, there were no alarms, no warnings, no sudden flash of realization. Just the quiet, suffocating weight of trust until the trap closed around him. What makes this story so haunting is how ordinary it must have felt to him. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic in the way we imagine. Just men in a room, the smell of cigarettes and aftershave, the shuffle of chairs, the quiet pulse of anticipation. And then, silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. It's in that silence that the truth must have revealed itself. Perhaps it was the way the men stood too close, or the way one door locked behind him, softly but firmly. Or maybe it was the absence of ritual, the missing cues he had expected. That's when the first flicker of doubt might have crossed his mind. And doubt, once it creeps in, spreads like wildfire. The trap was sprung. He was not there to be made. He was there to be erased. There's a cruelty in how the mafia delivers its justice. They don't just kill, they teach. Every act of violence is a lesson, a message to the living. Tommy's death wasn't just punishment, it was a warning. A reminder that no man, no matter how feared, no matter how ambitious, is bigger than the code. But in that moment, as reality crashed down around him, Tommy was just a man. A man who had wanted too much, too quickly. A man who had confused fear for respect. A man who believed in a promise that was never real. What happened next has been told in fragments, whispers, shadows of truth. Some say he never had the chance to fight, that it was quick, efficient, merciless. Others suggest he realized what was happening too late, that he screamed, that he begged, that the rage in him flared one last time before it was extinguished. The truth, like the body, was buried deep. What we know is that Tommy never walked out of that room. The ceremony he dreamed of became his execution. The men he trusted became his executioners. The future he thought he had been promised turned into the very thing that destroyed him. It is almost poetic, in a dark and merciless way. The mafia gave him his dream, only to twist it into his nightmare. They let him believe he had finally earned the respect he craved, and then they used that belief to lead him into silence. That was the code at work. Not kindness, not cruelty, but balance. A debt had been written in blood, and only blood could pay it back. Outside, the city carried on. Cars honked, trains roared, people hurried through the cold, none of them knowing that inside a small, hidden room, a man's life had just been extinguished. That's how the mafia worked. Quiet, efficient, invisible. One moment a man was there, laughing, smoking, drinking. The next, he was a ghost, swallowed by the silence. And back in Queens, in bars and backrooms, friends waited for the phone call that would never come. Jimmy Burke expected to celebrate. Henry Hill expected to toast the new made man in their crew. But the phone stayed silent, and with every passing hour, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. They didn't know it yet, but they had already lost him. That is the tragedy of January 14th. A day that should have been Tommy's rebirth became his end. A day that should have crowned him only buried him deeper. He had walked into the trap without hesitation, blinded by ambition, deaf to the whispers of betrayal. And the cruelest part is this. To his very last step, he believed. He believed he was finally crossing into greatness. He believed he was about to receive the honor he had bled and killed for. He believed, even as the trap closed, that this was his destiny. But destiny has sharp teeth. And for Tommy DeSimone, those teeth closed around him on that cold January day, never letting go. What remained was silence and questions, and the haunting image of a man who wanted everything and ended up with nothing. Because in the Mafia, the only ceremony he truly received was death. And the world, waiting on the other side of that closed door, would soon discover that Tommy DeSimone was gone. Forever. Chapter 21. Never seen again. He walked into the cold of January with a grin on his face, believing the crown of his world was finally within reach. Hours later, he was gone. Not dead in the public sense, not laid out for a wake with candles and rosaries, not mourned with flowers on a headstone. Just gone. One moment, flesh and blood, breathing and burning with ambition. The next, silence. The kind of silence that swallows a man whole, leaving not even a shadow behind. That was the fate of Tommy DeSimone, a gangster so feared, so unpredictable, so reckless, that his end could never be straightforward. His vanishing became legend. No body, no ceremony, no answers, just whispers in the bars of Queens, rumors on street corners, and the eerie reality that a man so loud, so violent, so alive, could be erased in a single night. The first hours after his disappearance were filled with anticipation. Friends expected the phone to ring. They thought he would come swaggering back, chest puffed out, with the new title he had dreamed of his entire life. A made man. That was the promise. That was the bait. They poured drinks, waiting to toast his ascension, each minute stretching into hours. But the call never came. For men like Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill, this wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. The Mafia is built on rituals and signals, and silence is rarely accidental. When the hours bled into a full day, they knew something was wrong. By the second day, wrong had hardened into dread. By the third, it was certain. Tommy wasn't coming back. Imagine that realization creeping in. The steady collapse of hope. The dawning truth that their friend, their enforcer, their wild card, hadn't been promoted at all. He had been punished. Silently, efficiently, permanently. And because it was mafia business, there would be no funeral, no grave to visit, no certainty about how it had happened. Just the void. That void became its own kind of violence. For a man who had lived his entire life in excess. Excess laughter, excess rage, excess bloodshed. The nothingness of his end was almost poetic. The Mafia didn't just kill Tommy. They erased him. They took the very thing he thrived on, fear, attention, notoriety, and replaced it with absence. No body meant no closure. To his family, he was simply gone. To his crew, he was a ghost. To the street, he became a cautionary tale. Every whispered version of his death carried its own flavor of horror. Some said he was shot in the back of the head the moment he entered the room. Others swore he was tortured first, beaten as payment for the insults and murders that had stacked against him. A few claimed he was buried in a shallow grave, moved, reburied, and then lost forever. The truth remains buried with him. And that uncertainty is part of the Mafia's genius. A body speaks. A body is evidence, proof, a permanent reminder. But silence is more powerful. It leaves imagination to do the work, painting darker pictures than reality ever could. By making Tommy disappear without a trace, the Mafia not only avenged Billy Bats, they reminded everyone of their reach. They showed that even the loudest man could be silenced without echo. Think about the psychological torture of it. Every knock on a door, every late-night phone call, every whisper in a bar could spark the thought, maybe he's alive. Maybe he'll walk back in. But as weeks turned into months, that hope withered into a certainty too heavy to carry. He wasn't coming back. He was never coming back. And in that silence, fear grew. Because if it could happen to Tommy, it could happen to anyone. For Henry Hill, it was a turning point. He later admitted that the disappearance rattled him in ways few things ever had. Tommy wasn't just a friend. He was proof of how fragile life in the Mafia really was. You could think you were untouchable. You could laugh, kill, celebrate, live like a king one day. And the next, you were nothing. Jimmy Burke, on the other hand, handled it differently. Some say he was devastated. Others say he knew from the start what had happened. The truth is buried in his silence, too. But one thing is certain. Jimmy lost his most volatile weapon. Tommy had been his hammer, the man he unleashed when fear was needed. Losing him meant more than losing a friend. It meant losing a shield, a tool, an enforcer whose reputation alone could bend a room. But here's the irony. The very violence that made Tommy so valuable is what got him killed. His reputation had crossed the line from fear to liability. By murdering a made man, he had sealed his fate years earlier. The Lufthansa heist and its fallout may have hastened things, but the verdict had already been written in the code of La Cosa Nostra. Still, the disappearance left questions. Where was he buried? Who pulled the trigger? Did he know, in those final seconds, that it was over? Or did he go down fighting, cursing the men who betrayed him? Each theory adds a new layer of legend, a new ghost story to a man who already lived like one. The lack of answers is its own kind of punishment. For his family, the silence stretched into decades. No funeral, no grave, no certainty, just the absence of a father, a husband, a son. For the crew, it was a lesson carved into their bones. And for history, it became a mystery that still lingers in the shadows of mafia lore. Never seen again. That's the headline. But between those words lies something more chilling. It wasn't just disappearance. It was annihilation. A man who once dominated rooms, who left trails of blood and fear in his wake, was reduced to nothing more than rumors. That is the power of the mafia code, not just to kill, but to erase. And so the legend of Tommy DeSimone ends not with a bang, but with a void. A silence so complete it still echoes decades later. His story is retold in books, in films, in documentaries, but the man himself is dust scattered in the wind. No one ever found him. No one ever will. And that silence, that haunting absence, is perhaps the most brutal punishment of all. Because for a man who lived so loudly, disappearing without a trace is the cruelest ending imaginable. But the story doesn't end here. His vanishing may have closed one chapter, but it opened another. Questions of loyalty, vengeance, and the dangerous ripples left behind when the mafia decides to erase a man from existence. And in those ripples, more blood would be spilled. Chapter 22, Theories of Death. The truth about Tommy DeSimone's death has never been written in ink. Instead, it lingers in whispers, half-remembered confessions, and the shifting sands of underworld rumor. What is certain is this. One January morning in 1979, Tommy walked into a room believing he was about to become a made man. By that night, he was gone forever. How it happened, and who was holding the gun, is a mystery that has haunted mob history for more than 4 decades. Some accounts point straight to the Gambinos. After all, Billy Batts was one of their own. A made man, respected, untouchable by the unwritten law of Cosa Nostra. When Tommy beat him, mocked him, and ultimately killed him, he didn't just cross a line. He shattered it. It didn't matter how many years passed or how many favors his crew pulled. In mafia culture, that kind of insult is never forgotten. Revenge might wait, but it always comes. In one version of the story, the Gambinos set the trap. They told Tommy he was going to be inducted. They let him dress sharp, let him believe his dream was about to come true. And when he walked into the room, proud and expectant, he was greeted not with honor, but with bullets. A swift execution. The kind of clean, businesslike punishment the mafia reserved for those who broke its deepest rules. But there are darker versions. In some tellings, it wasn't quick. It was slow, painful, a deliberate act of vengeance meant to settle a score in blood. Some say John Gotti himself, who was close to Billy Batts, made sure the punishment fit the crime. The story goes that Tommy was tortured before being killed, beaten in ways that mirrored the savage treatment he had inflicted on others. In this version, his end wasn't justice, it was payback. Theories spread like wildfire because no body was ever found. And when there's no evidence, imagination fills the gaps. Some claim he was buried in a shallow grave out on Long Island, only to be moved later when construction threatened to uncover him. Others believe he was dumped in the swamps of New Jersey, where the mud and water erased all traces. A few even suggest he was dismembered, scattered, reduced to nothing so that not even a single bone could testify. Henry Hill, the associate who later became an informant, offered his own version years later. He said Tommy was tricked into believing he was about to be made, and that he was killed by the Gambinos as revenge for bats. But Henry's accounts shifted over time, colored by memory, drugs, and the weight of storytelling. Was he recalling truth, or just piecing together rumors the way everyone else did? The uncertainty only fuels the legend. There's also the theory that Jimmy Burke himself may have allowed it to happen. Jimmy was protective of Tommy, but he was also pragmatic. By the time of the Lufthansa heist, paranoia was running high. Associates were disappearing left and right. Tommy, with his unpredictable violence and mounting debts to the Mafia code, was becoming more of a liability than an asset. It's possible Jimmy knew the hit was coming, maybe even stepped aside to let it happen. Some even whisper he may have given a subtle nod of approval. In that world, loyalty is always weighed against survival. The Gotti angle adds another layer of intrigue. John Gotti was not yet the famous dapper Don he would become, but he already carried weight in the Gambino family. Billy Batts had been his friend. Revenge was not just business, it was personal. Some mob historians believe Gotti's crew took part directly. Ensuring Tommy's end was more than an execution, it was a message. And that message was clear. No one, no matter how feared, gets away with killing a made man. Think about the psychology of it. Tommy was a man who thrived on fear. He killed to make statements, to prove dominance, to silence disrespect. But his killers flipped that script on him. They didn't just take his life, they took his certainty. They stripped him of the power he had wielded with such recklessness. They left behind only mystery. In a way, that was the ultimate punishment. Theories continue to swirl because the Mafia understands the power of uncertainty. A body is closure. A body is an answer. But a disappearance is a question mark that never stops echoing. It keeps fear alive long after the gunshot. For Tommy's family, that meant decades of not knowing where he lay, not being able to bury him. For his crew, it meant a lesson carved in silence. This is what happens when you break the code. For the underworld at large, it meant the legend of Tommy DeSimone only grew darker with time. And yet, the question remains. Did he die quickly, a single shot to the head, the way mob business is usually done? Or was it drawn out, brutal, an eye-for-an-eye act of vengeance for the beating he gave to Batts? Did Gotti stand in the room? Did Burke look the other way? Or was Tommy led by men he trusted, only to be betrayed at the moment he felt most secure? Every theory carries its own kind of horror. And maybe that's the point. The truth doesn't matter as much as the effect. By leaving the details hidden, the Mafia ensured that Tommy's story would serve as both a warning and a myth. A cautionary tale about ambition, arrogance, and the cost of breaking rules older than any single man. But imagine, for a moment, the final seconds of his life. Did he see it coming? Did he notice the look in the eyes of the men around him shift from respect to betrayal? Did he realize too late that the dream he had carried for years was a mirage? Or was the end sudden, a thunderclap in the dark, leaving no time for regret? That haunting uncertainty is the thread that binds all the theories together. Tommy DeSimone's death will never be written in black and white. It will remain, forever, in shades of rumor and fear. What we know is this: he vanished. What we believe is this: the Gambinos had their revenge. What we don't know is how. And that gap, the unanswered questions, the competing stories, the silence, is what gives his story its enduring power. Because in the Mafia, silence is louder than gunfire. And in Tommy's case, that silence still lingers, a ghostly reminder that even the most ruthless killers cannot escape the rules written in blood. But the story doesn't end here. Because even in death or disappearance, Tommy's shadow hung over everyone he touched. The theories of how he died are just one part of the legend. The real weight of his story lies in what his death set in motion. And those ripples would be felt for years. Chapter 23: The Family Left Behind. The knock never came. No phone call. No body. Just silence. For Tommy DeSimone's wife and children, His disappearance was not an ending. It was an open wound that never closed. One day he was there, volatile and larger than life, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the mafia code of silence. For the people left behind, the absence was louder than any gunshot. Imagine his wife, waiting in a small house where the walls already carried the echoes of tension. She knew what kind of man she had married, though no one could have fully prepared her for the storm that was Tommy. He lived fast, laughed hard, and lashed out without warning. Being married to him was like living beside a volcano. You never knew when it would erupt. But even then, she had never expected him to vanish completely, to be erased from the world as though he had never existed. She waited for days, then weeks, asking questions no one would answer. In the mafia world, family members were told nothing. Wives learned early that silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. Ask too much, and you might get pulled under the same wave that took your husband. Still, she had children to feed, children who kept asking when their father would walk through the door. How do you explain to a child that their father has disappeared into thin air, that the streets swallowed him whole? For the children, the absence was a shadow that stretched across their lives. They didn't have a grave to visit, no photograph propped against a tombstone to remind them where he lay. They had questions without answers, memories without closure. At school, whispers followed them. Their last name was a weight. Kids talk, adults gossip, and in the tight-knit world of mob neighborhoods, everyone knew the truth. They just didn't speak it out loud. In that silence, rumors trickled in. Maybe he had been killed by the Gambinos. Maybe Jimmy Burke had set him up. Maybe John Gotti himself had made sure the score was settled. Each rumor was a knife that cut again, reopening the wound. But without a body, without confirmation, the family was left in limbo, trapped between hope and despair. Was he dead, or had he somehow slipped away? That question hung over them like a storm cloud that never moved. The mafia thrived on that silence. It was part of the punishment. When someone was disappeared, it wasn't just about taking their life. It was about erasing them, wiping them from the story so completely that even their family was left with nothing. No closure, no goodbye. The disappearance itself became the message. This is what happens when you cross the line. And the family carried that burden for the rest of their lives. Tommy's wife learned quickly that survival meant adaptation. She stopped asking questions. She raised her children with the heavy knowledge that their father had been part of something dark, something dangerous. She bore the looks of neighbors, the pity of relatives, the quiet judgment that came with being tied to a man who had lived by the gun and died by it, even if no one ever found his body. For the children, the legacy was even more complicated. They inherited not only the absence, but also the stigma. In mob culture, children of fallen men often carried the mark. They grew up in the shadow of violence they didn't choose, trying to carve out normal lives while the ghosts of their father's choices haunted every step. Their memories of him were fragments: a laugh at the dinner table, a temper that could ignite in seconds, the sound of the door closing behind him for the last time. The silence around his disappearance wasn't just mafia tradition, it was mafia protection. For the bosses, it ensured there was no evidence, no case, no body for law enforcement to dig up. For the family, it meant living in an eternal question mark. They couldn't grieve properly because they couldn't be sure. They couldn't hate fully because they never had proof. They couldn't heal because the wound was never sealed. Think of grief like a book. Most people eventually reach the last page. They cry, they close it, and they learn to carry the weight. For Tommy's family, the last page was torn out. They kept flipping through the story, over and over, trying to find an ending that didn't exist. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet night when the kids asked about their father, the story started again, but it never finished. And then there was the mafia code, the unspoken rule that wives and children were untouchable, but also irrelevant. The organization didn't owe them answers, didn't owe them protection, didn't owe them even the courtesy of acknowledgement. To the mafia, Tommy's family was collateral damage. His wife might have once been welcomed at gatherings, the kids given gifts on Christmas. But after he vanished, doors closed. Invitations stopped. In that world, when a man was gone, his family became ghosts too. For Tommy's wife, there must have been moments of anger. She had stood by a man who was dangerous, unpredictable, but also charming and magnetic. He had promised a better life, the kind of life only the mob could provide. Money in the pocket, dinners out, respect in the neighborhood. But instead, she was left with nothing but whispers and fear. The respect vanished as quickly as he did. For the children, the anger was sharper. Children grow into questions. They wonder why their father didn't choose differently, why he couldn't walk away, why his ambition had to be paid with his life. They wonder why they had to grow up without him, why they inherited his sins without ever taking part in them. And in a cruel twist, they also carried his reputation. For some, it meant bullying, suspicion, isolation. For others, it was a twisted kind of fame, the kids of the gangster who vanished. But fame without love is hollow. The disappearance also left a void in the extended family. In Italian-American neighborhoods, family ties ran deep. Cousins, uncles, aunts, they all carried pieces of the silence. Some may have known more than they admitted. Others may have chosen willful ignorance, protecting themselves by not asking. Either way, the ripple effect was the same, a web of relatives bound together by a secret no one wanted to name. Decades later, the pain still lingers. The mafia thrives on secrecy, but for the family, that secrecy was a life sentence. Tommy's wife eventually moved on in her own way, but the scars remained. The children grew up, some carrying the shadow, others trying to outrun it. But no matter how far they went, the story followed them. Because Tommy DeSimone wasn't just a husband or a father, he was a myth. And myths don't die, they haunt. The haunting came not only from what he did, but from how he vanished. A man so loud, so reckless, so full of life, reduced to nothing but silence. For his family, that silence was deafening. Every day was a reminder that the mafia didn't just take his life. It took their peace, their closure, their chance to say goodbye. And yet, in that silence, there was also fear. Because even years later, asking too many questions could be dangerous. The mafia's reach extended far beyond the grave. For the family, survival meant keeping their heads down, living in the shadows of what they once were, never poking too hard at the wound. But silence doesn't erase love. For his wife and children, Tommy was not only the violent gangster the world remembers. He was also the man who came home at night, the father who held his kids, the husband who shared laughter across the table. That duality made the loss even harder. They had to mourn the man they loved while living with the man the world feared. And so, his disappearance was not only his punishment. It was theirs. A punishment that stretched across decades, a punishment written not in bullets, but in unanswered questions. Because when the mafia makes someone vanish, they don't just bury the man. They bury the truth. They bury the family right alongside him, in silence, in shadows, in the endless ache of not knowing. But silence has its own power. And for the DeSimone family, that silence was a life sentence they never chose. And yet, as time passed, one question never left them. Could the truth ever come out? Could someone break the code, even after all these years, and finally tell them where he was? Or would they carry that silence to their own graves, just as the mafia intended? That question, unanswered, unending, was the cruelest legacy Tommy DeSimone left behind. Chapter 24, Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill. The news never came with a knock on the door. It came in whispers, in silences, in looks that told the truth without ever saying it out loud. Tommy was gone, and for the two men closest to him, Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill, the world suddenly felt different. The three of them had once been inseparable, a wild trio of ambition and recklessness that had carved out their names in New York's underworld. But now one was gone, vanished into the shadows, and the weight of that loss hung like a curse on the two who remained. Jimmy Burke was a man who prided himself on control. He wasn't Italian, and so he could never be a made man, but he was still feared and respected in equal measure. He'd built a reputation on loyalty, cunning, and a ruthless streak that ran deep beneath his calm exterior. But Tommy's death, if it could even be called that, since no body ever surfaced, cut him in ways he couldn't show. This wasn't just about losing a soldier. This was about losing someone who was part of his very identity. For years, Jimmy had been the mentor, Tommy the hot-headed enforcer, Henry the smooth-talking hustler. Together they were a triangle, each one completing the other. Now, with one side snapped off, the balance collapsed. Jimmy never spoke openly about it, but those around him noticed the change. His laughter became harder, his temper sharper. Tommy's disappearance had been a message, not only to Tommy but to everyone around him, Jimmy included. The Mafia had rules, and Jimmy knew them better than most. You don't kill a made man without permission. You don't step too far over the line. Tommy had done both, and the punishment was absolute. For Jimmy, it was a reminder that even he wasn't untouchable. If they could take Tommy, they could take anyone. Henry Hill felt it differently. He wasn't wired like Jimmy. He wasn't a stone wall of control. He was a talker, a charmer, a man who loved the thrill but dreaded the consequences. Tommy's disappearance shook him to his core. For Henry, it wasn't just about losing a friend. It was about losing the illusion of invincibility. They had been young wolves, running wild through the streets, and now one of them had been cut down. It was proof that the life they had chosen wasn't just dangerous, it was doomed. Henry had known Tommy's volatility better than anyone. He'd seen the madness in his eyes, the way he could flip from laughter to rage in a heartbeat. He had also seen the admiration, the loyalty, the way Tommy would go to war for his friends without hesitation. That duality was what made him so dangerous and so magnetic. And now Henry was left with nothing but memories of that fire. Memories that burned even brighter because they ended so suddenly. The Lufthansa heist had been the high point, the score of scores, the kind of job men dreamed about. But even in its triumph, it carried a death sentence. In the weeks and months after the robbery, bodies piled up, one after another, as Jimmy sought to tie off loose ends. Henry watched it unfold like a man trapped inside a burning building. He saw the paranoia consume Jimmy, saw associates vanish, saw the blood run deeper than the money ever did. And threaded through it all was Tommy's absence. The way Jimmy spoke about him in private was telling. There was pride, yes, but also bitterness. Tommy had been reckless, uncontrollable, a spark that burned too hot. Jimmy had relied on him for muscle, for firepower, for the kind of violence that made others fall in line. But that same violence had sealed his fate, and in a way, Jimmy knew it had sealed his own too. Because Tommy wasn't just punished for his sins, he was punished for theirs. His death was a warning to all of them, a reminder of the leash they could never escape. Henry, meanwhile, started to crack. The weight of it all, Tommy's disappearance, the bodies stacking up, the FBI breathing down their necks, pushed him to the breaking point. He turned to drugs, drowning himself in cocaine and booze, trying to quiet the storm in his head. But it only made the paranoia worse. He felt the walls closing in, every shadow a threat, every silence a noose tightening. And with Tommy gone, he no longer had the illusion of safety. In many ways, Tommy had been the shield. His violence had kept others at bay. His reputation had made enemies think twice. Without him, Henry felt exposed, vulnerable. He began to see the writing on the wall. This life didn't end in retirement. It didn't end in peace. It ended in a shallow grave or a prison cell. And the realization gnawed at him until it became unbearable. For Jimmy, the paranoia took a different shape. He clung tighter to power, trusting fewer people, cutting ties with anyone he suspected of weakness. He became colder, more calculating. The money from Lufthansa was supposed to be freedom, but instead it became a curse. Every dollar carried blood on it. Every bundle of cash whispered of betrayal. And with Tommy gone, the whispers only grew louder. Henry's path would eventually take him to the unthinkable, betrayal. When the law closed in, when the pressure reached its peak, he flipped. He became an informant, trading loyalty for survival. And when he told his story, when he laid bare the secrets of the mob, Tommy's name was there, shining like a warning flare. The world learned of the madness, the murders, the raw violence that had defined him. But for Henry, it wasn't about telling the world. It was about saving his own skin. Jimmy's fate was different. He never broke, never spoke. But silence wasn't enough to save him. He was eventually convicted, sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Behind those walls, with nothing but time to think, the ghosts must have haunted him. Ghosts of the men he killed, the friends he betrayed, and above all, the young enforcer who had once been his right hand. Tommy's absence was a wound that never closed, a reminder of the empire they built and the price they paid. The story of Tommy's death, or disappearance, didn't just belong to him. It belonged to all of them. Jimmy, Henry, the crew, they were bound together in a tapestry of blood and ambition. And when one thread was pulled, the whole thing began to unravel. Tommy's end wasn't just his own. It was the beginning of the end for everyone around him. In the end, Jimmy died in prison, a man who had once commanded fear, but who lived his final days as just another inmate, another ghost of the old days. Henry lived on, hidden under a new name, a man forever looking over his shoulder, haunted by the life he had once embraced. Both men carried Tommy with them, in different ways, to the grave. Tommy had been the wildest of the three, the most unpredictable, the most dangerous. But he was also the glue, the energy, the raw force that made their crew what it was. Without him, everything cracked. Without him, the empire fell. And so the story of Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill is not just the story of what happened after Tommy's death. It is the story of how his death defined them, shaped their ends, and became the silent companion they could never escape. Because in the Mafia, no one walks away clean. And for the two men closest to Tommy, his disappearance wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was the beginning of their own undoing. But even then, the question lingered. If Tommy had lived, if he had been made instead of murdered, would the story have been different? Or was this always how it was going to end, for all of them, one way or another? That question would haunt Jimmy until his last breath and Henry until the end of his days, a ghost that whispered of what might have been, but never was. Chapter 25, The Mafia's Lesson. The decision was already made long before Tommy ever walked into that room. His fate wasn't determined by a single bullet or a single betrayal. It was sealed by a code that stretched back generations. In the Mafia, rules weren't suggestions. They weren't guidelines. They were iron, unbreakable, written in blood. And Tommy DeSimone, with his rage, his recklessness, and his defiance, had broken the one rule no man could ever come back from. Imagine a young soldier in an ancient army stepping out of line, daring to strike a general without permission. That soldier might win the fight in the moment, but he would never survive the aftermath. The Mafia worked the same way. When Tommy killed a made man without approval, Billy Batts, it didn't matter how loyal he was, how feared he was, or how useful he could still be. The rule had been crossed, and the punishment was automatic. The men at the top, the bosses who sat in smoky backrooms sipping espresso, didn't see Tommy as a man anymore. They saw him as a message. His disappearance wasn't about one murder. It wasn't about revenge. It was about order. The Mafia couldn't function without rules, and those rules had to be enforced with ruthless consistency. If they allowed Tommy to live after what he'd done, every hot-headed soldier in New York would think he could get away with anything. That couldn't happen. The families knew it. And so, Tommy vanished. Jimmy Burke knew the score. Henry Hill knew it too. Deep down, they both understood why Tommy was gone, even if it gutted them to admit it. This wasn't personal, it was business. That was the phrase men like them repeated when blood was spilled, as if those words could strip away the horror. But for those who lived inside that world, business was just another way of saying survival. The Gambinos had to make an example out of Tommy. His end was a warning shot to everyone else who thought they could bend the rules. And the message landed hard. In the weeks after Tommy's disappearance, fear crept through the ranks like a cold draft in a locked room. Associates who once strutted with swagger now looked over their shoulders. Made men sat with a new sense of power, knowing the rules had just been reinforced in the most brutal way possible. If Tommy DeSimone, reckless, fearless, and untouchable in his crew, could be erased overnight, then no one was safe. That was the point. It's easy to see the Mafia as chaos, a swirl of violence and greed, but that's not how the bosses saw it. To them, it was order, a parallel government, a kingdom with laws, rituals, and punishments. And like any kingdom, it only survived because people believed in the structure. Killing Tommy wasn't an act of revenge. It was a civic duty, the mafia's equivalent of executing a traitor. It reinforced the idea that no man, no matter how feared, stood above the rules. For Henry Hill, this truth came with a chill. He'd always known the rules, but seeing them enforced with such finality rattled him. He understood now that the game had no room for mistakes. Loyalty wasn't enough. Success wasn't enough. One wrong move could erase you, and the world would keep spinning as if you'd never been there. That silence, the absence of ceremony, the lack of a grave, the vanishing without a trace, was part of the punishment. Not only was Tommy killed, but his memory was stripped of honor. In mafia terms, that was worse than death itself. Jimmy, hardened as he was, couldn't ignore the lesson either. He'd spent years building an empire, pulling off scores that made headlines, surrounding himself with loyal men. But Tommy's fate showed him that loyalty and success only went so far. The families had power beyond any crew. They could end a man's life with a nod, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Jimmy might have been feared, but he was still only an associate. He was still on the outside looking in. Tommy's death reminded him of that every day. The mafia thrived on fear. Not chaos, but calculated fear. And Tommy became the embodiment of that fear. A ghost story whispered to young associates who dreamed too big, who thought rules could be bent. His name became shorthand for what happened when ambition outweighed discipline. He was the cautionary tale, the warning carved in shadows. Cross the line, and you disappear. This wasn't unique to Tommy. The mafia had always dealt with problems the same way. When men strayed, when they broke the code, they vanished. It was cleaner than a public spectacle. No trial, no headline, no closure. Just silence. The silence was the point. It left everyone wondering, waiting, uneasy. It made the lesson sink deeper. And with Tommy, that silence screamed louder than any gunshot ever could. The code itself was simple, but brutal. Killing a made man without permission was like pulling a brick from the foundation of a house. If the structure wasn't reinforced, the whole thing could collapse. Tommy thought he could get away with it because of who he ran with. He thought Jimmy's power and Henry's connections could shield him. But the mafia wasn't built on individuals. It was built on tradition, on rules written long before Tommy was born. The families had outlived stronger men than him, and they would outlive him too. The irony was that Tommy had wanted nothing more than to be made himself. It was the dream that drove every young associate to rise out of the shadows, to earn the ring of protection that came with that sacred oath. But by killing a made man without permission, Tommy destroyed his only path to that dream. Instead of rising into the mafia's inner circle, he was erased by it. And yet, even in his death, Tommy played a role. His disappearance reminded the city's underworld that the rules weren't negotiable. That fear kept the machine running. Without it, the mafia would have been nothing more than a loose collection of thugs. With it, they were an empire. For the men who remained, Tommy's ghost never left. Every time an associate lost his temper, every time someone suggested a reckless move, the memory surfaced. Remember, Tommy. Those two words were enough to pull anyone back in line. But for Jimmy and Henry, the lesson was sharper, more personal. They didn't just see Tommy as a warning. They saw him as a friend who paid the ultimate price. That duality haunted them. They understood why it happened, but that didn't make it easier to accept. They were forced to live with the knowledge that in their world, even the fiercest loyalty could end in betrayal. Tommy's vanishing wasn't just his own tragedy. It was the mafia reminding everyone that no man was bigger than the code. And in the end, that code was all that mattered. The silence around his death spoke volumes. No funeral, no grave, no closure, just absence. And absence, in the mafia, was its own language, one that carried more weight than words ever could. Even now, decades later, the lesson lingers. Tommy DeSimone's name is remembered not just because of his violence, not just because of his role in legendary heists, but because of how he died, or rather, how he disappeared. He became the rule etched in bone and blood. Break the code, and you're erased. But there's one question the Mafia could never control. Did Tommy know, in those final moments, why he was being silenced? Did he realize he had become the example, the lesson, the ghost? Or did he still believe, even as the trap closed, that he was walking toward the dream he'd chased his whole life? That uncertainty is the cruelest part of all. And it leaves us with a chilling thought. In the Mafia, the rules always win. And the men who break them never see it coming, until it's too late. Chapter 26. Pop Culture and Goodfellas. It starts not in a backroom of Queens, not in the shadows of an airport heist, but on the silver screen. A darkened theater, a hush falling over the audience as a wiry figure in a suit leans forward, his voice sharp as broken glass, his laughter rattling like a machine gun. One question cuts the air. Funny how? Funny like I'm a clown. I amuse you. The audience laughs nervously, unsure if it's safe to laugh at all. That was Joe Pesci's moment, the moment that would immortalize Tommy DeSimone in the public imagination. A man long vanished into Mafia silence came roaring back to life, not through the underworld's whispers, but through Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. And suddenly, a ghost who had disappeared without a body, without a grave, had become one of the most unforgettable characters in movie history. The irony is that the real Tommy DeSimone was very different from the character who lived forever on screen. Joe Pesci's portrayal captured something essential. The volatility, the unpredictability, the hair-trigger temper that could shift from laughter to murder in a single breath. But Hollywood reshaped the details. The real Tommy was taller, broader, far more imposing physically. In the film, he was compressed into a shorter, wiry, almost manic presence. Yet the spirit, the madness, the danger, they were all there. Henry Hill, who lived through it all, would later admit that Joe Pesci nailed it. Not in every detail, not in appearance, but in essence. That famous funny how scene? It wasn't written. It was improvised, born from an actual encounter Joe Pesci had witnessed, when a gangster turned laughter into menace with the flick of a word. Scorsese loved it so much that he built it into the film. And when audiences saw it, they felt what Hill and others had lived, the terror of never knowing if Tommy was joking or if he was about to pull the trigger. The movie did what the Mafia never allowed, gave Tommy DeSimone a voice after death. In the streets, his name had become a warning, a whispered lesson about rules broken and debts paid. But in Goodfellas, he was given center stage, his violence turned into art, his madness woven into one of cinema's greatest performances. The world that had swallowed him whole now spat him back out as legend. When Joe Pesci won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1991, it wasn't just a victory for an actor. It was Tommy's resurrection. Millions of people who had never heard his name now knew his story, or at least a version of it. The violence, the paranoia, the charm that could twist into cruelty, all of it wrapped in a performance that left viewers shaken long after the credits rolled. But here lies the haunting truth. What Hollywood celebrated, others remembered with scars. For the families of men Tommy had killed, there was no glamour, no applause. They saw their loved one's murderer transformed into an unforgettable character, and the world applauded his savagery. For them, the laughter in theaters must have echoed like salt in an open wound. The magic of cinema doesn't erase the brutality of real life, it only reframes it. And yet, it's undeniable that Goodfellas gave Tommy something he never had in life: immortality. In reality, he was erased. No funeral, no ceremony, no obituary in the papers. He became another ghost swallowed by the Mafia's silence. But in film, he was larger than life, his story replayed endlessly, each viewing cementing his place in cultural memory. It was as if Hollywood gave him the funeral he never had, with millions watching. That duality is unsettling. On one hand, the film preserved the truth of what it felt like to be near Tommy, a mix of excitement, fear, and dread, like standing too close to a lit fuse. On the other, it blurred the line between fact and fiction, turning a real killer into entertainment. And in that blur lies a question we can't escape. When we laugh at Joe Pesci's brilliance, are we also laughing at the terror that real men lived through? The line between reality and performance is razor thin in this story. The real Tommy DeSimone was unpredictable, violent, and terrifying. Joe Pesci's Tommy DeVito, the fictionalized version, was all of those things too, but with the polish of performance, the rhythm of comedy, the precision of craft. One was chaos, the other was art. Yet both could leave a room silent, unsure of what might happen next. Henry Hill himself, whose memoir Wise Guy inspired the film, understood the irony. He'd lived through the horror, but even he couldn't help but admire how accurately Scorsese captured the feeling of it. When Hill watched the movie, he said it was like seeing ghosts walk again. Men long gone, men buried in silence, brought back to life on screen with uncanny precision. It was chilling, even for him. The public, of course, didn't see the ghosts. They saw the movie, the spectacle, the dazzling dance of camera and dialogue. And they loved it. Tommy DeVito became one of the most quoted characters in film history. People repeated his lines in bars, in schoolyards, in offices. They laughed at the jokes, marveled at the violence, reveled in the madness. What had once been feared in the shadows became entertainment under bright lights. That's the strange power of pop culture. It can take a man who disappeared into nothingness and make him unforgettable. It can turn fear into fascination, horror into applause. Tommy DeSimone may have vanished from the real world on a cold January day in 1979, but in pop culture, he was reborn in 1990. And in that form, he has lived longer than he ever could have imagined. Joe Pesci himself felt the weight of it. He'd grown up around tough neighborhoods. He understood the rhythm of street talk, the menace hidden behind laughter. But even he admitted that playing Tommy DeVito took something out of him. It was too close, too raw, too real. That Oscar he held on stage wasn't just for a performance. It was for channeling a ghost, for giving the world a glimpse of the monster and the man intertwined. But what of the real Tommy's family? What of the wife and children left behind, who lived not with applause, but with absence? For them, the movie must have been unbearable. To see the world celebrate the memory of a man who had caused so much pain, and to know that his own body had never been returned, must have felt like living in a nightmare that never ended. And yet, even in that discomfort, there's a truth that cannot be denied. Without Goodfellas, Tommy DeSimone would have been a footnote, a name buried in FBI files, a ghost known only to the underworld. Instead, he became a symbol, a cultural touchstone, a character who taught audiences what real danger looks like when wrapped in charm and humor. He became unforgettable. That's the paradox of pop culture. It doesn't just reflect reality. It reshapes it, repackages it, and feeds it back to us in a way we can consume. Tommy's violence became a story. His madness became a performance. His death became an enigma that audiences could debate long after the credits rolled. And in that transformation, he achieved what so many in the mafia world crave, a kind of immortality. But what does immortality mean when it's built on fear, blood, and silence? That question lingers long after the applause fades. Because behind the Oscar, behind the quotes, behind the scenes replayed again and again, lies a man who vanished without a trace, whose family never saw his body, whose name became a cautionary tale. Pop culture gave him life, but it also gave him something he never earned: glamour. The truth is harsher. The real Tommy wasn't a star. He wasn't a character. He was a killer, reckless and unstable, who met a violent end because he couldn't follow the rules. And yet, thanks to Joe Pesci, he will live forever as one of cinema's greatest characters. That contradiction is the final twist in his story, the last laugh of a man who once terrified everyone around him. And maybe that's the most chilling thing of all. Because when the lights come up, when the credits roll, when the audience walks out of the theater quoting lines and laughing at jokes, the real story still waits in the shadows. A man who disappeared, a family who grieved, a mafia code enforced in silence. That's where the truth lives, just beyond the glow of Hollywood's lights. So the question remains, when we remember Tommy today, are we remembering the man or the myth, the killer or the character, the ghost or the legend? The line is blurred forever. And maybe that's exactly how the Mafia would have wanted it. Because in the end, silence was their power. And even in pop culture, the silence of what really happened to Tommy DeSimone still echoes louder than any applause. Chapter 27. The Ghost of Tommy D. It begins with silence. Not the silence of a sleeping city, nor the silence of snowfall on dark streets, but a silence that feels like a locked door. A silence heavy with absence. On January 14th, 1979, Tommy DeSimone walked into that silence and never came out. No body was found. No funeral was held. No one in his family was given answers. And yet his shadow lingers, thick as smoke. The story of Tommy is one of contradictions. He was a young man who craved respect, who wanted the ultimate badge of honor in the Mafia world, to be a made man. To cross that threshold meant everything: protection, power, the weight of tradition behind your name. But he also carried a temper like a lit fuse, burning fast and uncontrollably. In the Mafia, rules are what hold chaos at bay. Tommy's problem was simple. His violence was louder than his loyalty. From the beginning, he seemed destined for both glory and disaster. Born into the life, he wore ambition like a second skin. To his friends, he was loyal, funny, magnetic. To his enemies, he was unpredictable, terrifying, and quick to settle scores. It's said that people were never sure which version of Tommy they would meet, the charmer or the killer. That uncertainty became his trademark. But uncertainty is not admired in the world he lived in. It is feared, and in a world built on rules, fear without control is dangerous. Tommy broke the code more than once, but the murder of a made man, Billy Batts, was the wound that never healed. No matter how much time passed, that single act branded him with a death sentence. The Mafia's code is not just a set of guidelines. It is the spine of their world. To break it is to become expendable. And so Tommy's ambition turned inward, eating away at him. He thought the Lufthansa heist, the connections, the loyalty to Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill would be enough to tip the scales back in his favor. He thought his record as a loyal soldier would erase the sins of his temper. He thought he could outrun the rules. He was wrong. The end came cloaked as opportunity. To be made, that was the dream. But it was also the bait. Like a moth drawn to a flame, Tommy couldn't resist it. When he walked out the door that winter day, he believed he was finally stepping into the light he'd chased his whole life. Instead, he walked into the shadows. What followed has never been revealed. There are theories, whispers, fragments of stories. Some say he was shot in the back of the head, quick and clean, like so many Mafia executions. Others say it was slower, punishment for the chaos he caused, a lesson written in blood. Whoever gave the order, whether it was John Gotti's crew or the Gambinos avenging Bats, one thing is certain: Tommy DeSimone never walked back out. And that's where the ghost begins. Because the Mafia didn't just kill him, they erased him. To vanish is worse than to die. A body, a grave, even a name in the paper gives closure. To disappear into thin air leaves only questions, and questions are like wounds that never heal. His wife was left with silence. His children were left with stories. His friends were left with paranoia. The FBI searched. Informants whispered. But nothing solid ever surfaced. The absence itself became the message. It told everyone in the underworld what happens when rules are broken, when tempers outrun discipline, when ambition blinds reason. Tommy became the warning. The silence around him spoke louder than his laughter ever had. But silence cannot erase memory. Stories about Tommy lingered in bars, in prisons, in whispered conversations over cigarettes and drinks. They spoke of his charm, his unpredictability, the way he could make you laugh one moment and terrify you the next. They spoke of the violence he carried like a second language, casual and brutal. And they spoke of his ambition, a hunger so sharp it blinded him to the dangers around him. In the end, Tommy DeSimone was not remembered as a powerful boss or a respected made man. He was remembered as a ghost. A ghost who wanted power but didn't know how to hold it. A ghost who thought fear could replace respect. A ghost who disappeared because he forgot that in the Mafia, rules are not suggestions. They are the oxygen that keeps the world alive. And yet, Even in death, or in disappearance, Tommy managed to carve his name into history, not through his own actions, but through what came after. Through Henry Hill's testimony, through Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, through Joe Pesci's unforgettable performance. The world remembers the ghost of Tommy D not because of what he achieved, but because of the story of how he vanished. That is the cruel irony of his life. In the end, he got what he wanted, immortality, but not the kind he dreamed of. Not the respect of his peers, not the protection of the mafia, not the throne of a made man. Instead, he lives on in stories told by others, in films that turned him into legend, in whispers about the rules he broke and the price he paid. His immortality is built not on respect, but on caution, not on honor, but on fear. What remains today is the shadow of a man who wanted to be larger than life, but instead became larger in death. The mafia world moves on, families change, crews rise and fall. But Tommy's ghost remains, a reminder that no one is untouchable, that ambition without control is suicide, and that the code is stronger than any one man's hunger. So the question lingers, what was Tommy's legacy? Was it his violence? His ambition? His disappearance? Or is his legacy simply the silence he left behind? A silence that still rattles louder than gunfire in the story of organized crime? The truth is, the ghost of Tommy D cannot be pinned down. He is part myth, part memory, part nightmare. To some, he was a friend. To others, a monster. To his family, he was a husband and father who never came home. To the mafia, he was a lesson. To Hollywood, he was a character. To the world, he was the man who vanished. And maybe that is the final word on Tommy DeSimone. Not killer, not gangster, not even victim, but ghost. A ghost that haunts the story of the mafia, a ghost that laughs in Joe Pesci's voice, a ghost that walked into a room one January morning and was never seen again. And as the credits roll on his story, one truth remains. In the mafia, respect is everything. Tommy wanted it so badly he was willing to kill for it. But in the end, it wasn't bullets that defined him. It was silence. The ghost of Tommy D still lingers.